Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It all started with a question I couldn't shake. I found myself wondering, as I stood in the middle of my parents' old house, what exactly am I looking at? The place had always felt strange, even when I was young. The air was thick with the weight of years, as if every corner held a secret it wasn't ready to reveal. When I walked in that evening, I expected nothing more than the usual quiet, the creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the old clock in the hallway. But something was off. I had come to my parents' house to collect a few things. They had moved to another city years ago, and the house, left empty, seemed to be fading slowly into the past. Dust settled on every surface, the smell of old wood and leather lingering in the air. It was a home that no longer felt like one. I was looking through boxes in the attic when I stumbled upon it. A large, framed portrait carefully wrapped in a faded cloth. I had never seen it before, not in all my visits to this house. Curious, I unraveled the cloth and set the portrait upright. At first, nothing seemed unusual. It was a painting of my family, gathered together in front of a fireplace, all of them smiling as if nothing could ever go wrong. But then, I noticed it. The eyes. They were too sharp, too intense. At first glance, they seemed to be staring ahead, trapped in the frame as they had been for years. But when I looked a second time, I felt it, an odd sensation, like they were watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, unsure whether I had imagined it. I stepped back, my pulse quickening, and studied the painting more carefully. There was something unsettling about the way the eyes followed me, never quite settling on the fixed positions they should have had. I reached out to touch the glass, my fingers trembling. The cool surface of the frame made me feel grounded, but the feeling in my chest grew heavier. For a moment, I almost pulled my hand away, as if something in the room was urging me to do so. But I ignored the instinct and pressed my palm against the frame. That's when it happened. The eyes. They moved. It was so subtle, so faint, I almost didn't believe it. But it was unmistakable. The eyes of the figures on the portrait, those lifeless faces, shifted toward me. Slowly, deliberately. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced to explain what I had just seen. Had I imagined it? Could it have been a trick of the light? I reached for my phone and snapped a photo. I figured I might show it to someone later, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a mistake by keeping the portrait around. Something about it felt wrong. I hesitated, then placed the portrait back on the floor, wrapping it in the cloth once more. I needed to leave, to get out of this house. The air seemed heavier now, thicker, like it was pressing in on me. I couldn't explain why I felt this way, but it was as if the walls were watching, waiting. As I descended the attic stairs, I heard a soft noise behind me. A rustle. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, light, almost inaudible. I froze, listening intently, my heart pounding. The steps weren't from upstairs, not from anyone who had been in the house. They were different. Closer. I turned to look back at the attic stairs. Nothing. But the sensation didn't go away. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't help but feel that I wasn't alone. Something had changed, and it was waiting for me. The house, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a maze of shadows, each corner hiding something I didn't want to see. The atmosphere grew thick, almost suffocating. The temperature seemed to drop as I made my way down the hall, but I didn't dare look back. Not yet. The sound of footsteps, though, was getting closer. I could hear them now, crisp, deliberate, like someone was pacing just behind me, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I rushed to the front door, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. The cold metal felt stiff in my hand, as though something was holding it from the other side. I tried again, my grip tightening, but the door remained locked. I could feel my pulse in my throat, and the panic was setting in. Then, a voice. A whisper, so faint it was barely audible. "Don't leave." I spun around, searching the empty room. The whisper sounded like it was coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was as though the house itself had spoken, as though the walls were alive, drawing me back in. I knew I had to escape, but something told me the door wouldn't open. Not yet. Not until it was ready. And I knew that I wasn't alone anymore. I tried the door again, my fingers trembling, but it remained stubbornly locked. Panic began to settle deep in my chest. My mind raced, looking for any rational explanation. Maybe the lock had jammed, maybe there was something wrong with the handle. But as I pulled harder, I realized it wasn't just the door. It was everything. The house, which had once felt like an empty shell, now seemed alive. I could almost feel the weight of the walls pressing in on me, as though they were closing in, watching, waiting. The air was thick, dense with something I couldn't identify, something wrong, something unnatural. I stepped back from the door, my gaze shifting nervously around the room. The old hallway was lined with faded family photos, but now their faces seemed to have lost their warmth. The smiles on their faces felt hollow, like they were trapped in time, suspended forever. But it was more than that. The eyes. They seemed to glint in the dim light, as though they were aware of me, following my every move. I forced myself to take a deep breath and turned away from the door. I had to find another way out, I told myself. The back door, perhaps. The kitchen window. Anything. But as I made my way down the dark hallway, I heard it again, the soft, almost imperceptible footsteps following me. It was as if someone was right behind me, moving at the same pace, but when I turned to look, no one was there. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but still, no one appeared. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, a loud, thudding drum that seemed to drown out every other sound. I reached the kitchen and rushed toward the back door, but as my hand touched the knob, it froze. I felt it, someone standing just behind me. The air grew heavier, thick with dread, and I could almost hear the faintest whisper, like a voice in the wind. "Stay." I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but again, nothing. Just the empty kitchen, the dim glow of the dying daylight filtering through the window. I was alone, or so I thought. I felt a chill run down my spine. My gaze fell on the window, but the reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. A figure, barely visible in the fading light, stood just behind me. It wasn't clear at first, but as I blinked, it became more defined. A shadow. Tall, almost too tall for the space, looming in the reflection. I backed away, my pulse racing. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. but the figure remained unmoving. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. Slowly, I reached for the door again, my hand shaking, and turned the handle. This time, it opened. I stumbled outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. I wasn't safe, I knew that, but the house. I had to get away from it. I had to. But as I took a step down the porch stairs, I heard something that made my heart stop. A soft, familiar sound. The sound of footsteps, the same as before. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were coming from the porch, from the house. I turned around slowly, dread filling my chest. Through the dim light, I saw it. The portrait. It was now hanging on the porch wall, somehow moved, somehow placed there without explanation. The faces were the same, but the eyes, they were different. They were no longer just staring. They were watching me. I ran. I didn't care where I was going, just as long as I could escape the suffocating grip of the house. The footsteps behind me didn't stop, and neither did the whispers. They followed me, echoing in my ears, as if the house itself was calling me back. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the faint sound of leaves scraping the ground. But over it all, I could still hear the footsteps, steady, patient, relentless. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran, my breath ragged and shallow, my legs burning with every step. The darkness of the yard swallowed me whole, but I pushed forward, driven by a primal need to escape, to get away from the house that felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The footsteps followed me. They weren't hurried, but they were persistent, always there, matching my pace. Every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing, only the blackness of the night and the faint outline of the house behind me. But I could feel it. The presence. It was there, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I reached the end of the yard, where the trees grew thick and tangled, blocking my view of the road beyond. The footsteps were closer now, closer than ever before. I dared to glance behind me and caught a glimpse of something, just a shadow, a movement that was too fast, too fluid to be human. I quickened my pace, pushing through the trees. The cold night air bit at my skin, but I barely noticed it. My mind was consumed with the need to keep moving. I had to get away. But the footsteps grew louder, the sound of them now unmistakable, footsteps that seemed to echo in the night, in the very earth beneath me. I couldn't outrun them. I couldn't outrun whatever it was that followed me. And then I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was clear. Why are you running? The voice wasn't loud, but it pierced the silence around me, making my heart lurch in my chest. It was a voice I didn't recognize, but it felt like it was coming from within me, a voice that was more than just sound. It was a presence, an invasion of my thoughts. I spun around, half expecting to see something standing behind me, but there was nothing. The darkness was thick, and the trees loomed over me like silent giants, their branches reaching out like fingers. I didn't wait. I kept running. I didn't know how much time had passed, how long I'd been running through the night, but eventually I saw the faint outline of a road ahead. It was distant, barely visible through the thick woods. I pushed forward, driven by the faint hope that I could reach civilization, that I could find someone who would help me. But the sound of the footsteps never stopped. They were still there, growing louder with every step I took. I finally broke through the trees and found myself on the side of the road. The moon hung high above, casting an eerie light across the landscape. But the moment I stepped onto the pavement, I froze. The road was empty. There were no cars, no signs of life. Just the stillness of the night. And then I heard it again, the voice, this time right behind me, as if it had always been there, whispering in my ear. "You're not leaving." I turned quickly, expecting to see something, anything, but once again, there was nothing. Just the darkness. But the feeling was undeniable. It was as if the world around me had shifted, as if the very air had become thick with something terrible. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as though I was rooted to the spot, trapped in some invisible grip. I could hear the footsteps now, louder than ever, and I knew, without a doubt, that whatever was behind me was closing in. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and a shiver ran through me, like icy fingers had brushed against my skin. The voice came again, this time closer, almost directly in my ear. "Look." I didn't want to look. But my body betrayed me, and my head turned against my will. There, in the darkness, standing just a few feet away, was a figure. A silhouette, tall and shadowed, its features hidden in the night. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence, thick, oppressive, suffocating. It was as if the air around it had turned solid, pressing in on me from all sides. The figure stepped forward, and the air seemed to freeze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was as if my body was paralyzed, held captive by whatever force was behind it. "Do you remember?" the voice whispered again. "Do you remember what you saw?" I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, constricted. My pulse raced, thumping painfully in my ears. The figure took another step, its presence growing stronger, its shadow stretching toward me. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, the image of the portrait flashed into my mind, the faces, the eyes, the way they moved. I could still see them, still feel them watching me. And then, the figure spoke once more. "It's not over." I gasped, my breath catching in my throat, and in that moment, I knew. The house wasn't just a house. It was something more. Something that had been waiting, watching, for me. And now, whatever it was, it had followed me here. And there was no escaping it. The figure stepped closer, and the darkness seemed to swirl around it, pulling at the edges of my vision. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the sensation of something old, something ancient, and its weight was unbearable. I could feel its eyes, those unseen, piercing eyes, on me, watching me, waiting for something. The figure raised its hand slowly, as if in greeting, and for the first time, I saw something, just the faintest outline of its face. It wasn't human. It couldn't have been. Its features were distorted, blurry, like a reflection in broken glass. And yet, there was something disturbingly familiar about it. A pulse of terror shot through me, sharp and sudden. The voice, soft and insistent, whispered again, but this time it wasn't in my ear. It was in my mind. "Don't you remember? Don't you remember what you did?" I shook my head, desperate to make sense of what was happening. My heart was hammering in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get away from this thing, from this place. But my feet were still rooted to the spot, and the figure was closing in, its presence becoming more overwhelming with each passing second. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The pressure in my chest was suffocating, and I could feel the blood rushing to my head. It was as though the world itself was crumbling around me, unraveling. And then, as if the figure had reached into my very thoughts, memories began to flood my mind, faint images at first, then growing clearer, more vivid. I saw myself as a child, standing in front of the same house, the same portrait, with my parents beside me. We were all smiling, happy. But there was something wrong about the picture even then. The eyes. Those eyes had been there from the beginning, watching me, waiting. I had always known, hadn't I? I had always known that something was wrong, but I had ignored it, buried it deep inside. Now, it was too late to deny the truth. The figure took another step, its presence now suffocating. I could feel its cold, unnatural energy pressing in on me. My legs finally gave way, and I collapsed to my knees, my vision spinning. "Do you see it now?" the voice asked, almost tenderly. "Do you see what you brought upon yourself?" I gasped for air, my thoughts racing. What had I brought upon myself? What had I done? The figure moved closer still, until I could see its features more clearly. The face, it was distorted, as if it had been stretched and twisted out of shape. But underneath the distortion, there was something hauntingly familiar. It was me. The figure was me. I recoiled in shock, my mind reeling. No, it couldn't be. It wasn't possible. But as I looked at it, I couldn't deny the truth. The reflection in the figure's eyes, the twisted version of me, was the same as the one in the portrait. The same eyes, the same hollow smile, the same darkness. "You've been running from yourself," the voice said softly, almost sadly. "But there is no escape. Not now." Terror washed over me like a wave. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The house, the portrait, the footsteps, it was all tied to me. This thing, this twisted reflection, had been waiting for me all along, feeding on my fear, my guilt. It was a part of me. Something I had locked away, something I had never truly confronted. I could feel the weight of that truth pressing down on me, threatening to crush me under its weight. I had tried to escape, to run, but it was always there, always following me. The footsteps, the whispers, the eyes in the portrait, they had been guiding me, drawing me back to this moment. "You knew it all along," the figure said, its voice echoing in my mind. "You've been running, but the truth is, there is nowhere to run." I tried to push myself up, to stand, but my body wouldn't respond. The ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, pulling me deeper into the earth. The figure was standing over me now, its face a grotesque reflection of my own, its eyes cold and unblinking. And then, with a final, unbearable whisper, it spoke. "It's time to go home." And before I could react, before I could even think, the world around me dissolved into darkness. I awoke with a start, gasping for air as if I had been drowning. My heart was pounding, my head spinning, and for a moment, I thought I might be trapped in some nightmare from which I could never escape. The air was heavy, thick with a familiar chill. But then, as I sat up, I realized where I was. I was back in the house. The same house. The same rooms. The same oppressive silence. But this time, something was different. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive, pulsing with an energy that I couldn't explain. I stood up shakily, my legs unsteady, and made my way down the hallway. The walls seemed to close in on me, the portraits on the walls staring at me with those same cold, unblinking eyes. My breath caught in my throat as I reached the living room. There it was, the portrait. It was no longer just a picture. It had changed. The faces were no longer frozen in a smile. They were watching me. Their eyes moved, following my every movement, just like before. But this time, it wasn't just the eyes. The figure was there. The twisted version of me, standing in the background of the painting, staring out at me with that same hollow expression. It was waiting. And I knew, without a doubt, that there was no escape from it now. The house, the portrait, the figure, they were all a part of me, a part of my past. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to forget, they would always be with me. I had never truly left. And now, I never would. I stood frozen in the living room, staring at the portrait that seemed to breathe in time with me. The figure in the background, the distorted version of myself, had become more pronounced, more real. Its eyes were no longer distant, no longer a subtle shift in the shadows. They were now wide open, filled with an unnatural depth. They followed me with every movement, and as I took a hesitant step forward, the air grew colder. I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the low hum of an unseen force filled the room, vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. It was a noise that didn't come from the house, but from within me, resonating in my chest. The house wasn't just watching me, it was waiting for something. And I knew, with a sinking dread, that I was the reason it was waiting. I stumbled back, my eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, creeping along the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The familiar objects, the old couch, the wooden shelves, the dusty lamps, had taken on an eerie presence, as though they were no longer just inanimate things. They were participants in whatever was unfolding, supporting the unseen force that had already claimed this place. My feet moved on their own accord, backing away from the painting. But it wasn't enough. I could feel the presence of the figure in the background of the portrait, inching closer, reaching out toward me with silent, malevolent intent. My head throbbed as the whispers began again, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. "You can't run from what you are," the voice whispered, slithering into my thoughts like a poison. "You knew it, didn't you? You've always known." I closed my eyes, clenching my fists. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a nightmare. But when I opened my eyes, the portrait was even closer. The figure, that twisted reflection of me, was moving inch by inch, as if the fabric of reality was bending to its will. It was no longer just an image, it was becoming real. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just had to get away from the eyes that followed me, the voice that whispered my darkest truths, the suffocating pressure of the house itself. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the doors to the rooms seeming to move farther and farther away, mocking me. I ran through the kitchen, into the living room, but every time I turned a corner, I was still there. I was back in the same place. The same rooms. The same walls that seemed to breathe in time with the pulse of my fear. And then I saw it, standing at the end of the hallway. The figure. My twisted reflection, more defined now, standing motionless, staring at me with those hollow, lifeless eyes. "Why are you running?" the voice whispered, but this time it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from everywhere. The walls. The ceiling. The floor. It was the house itself, speaking to me, feeding on my terror. I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of the house, the whispers, the eyes, it was all too much. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, my chest tight with fear. My mind screamed for escape, for release, but I knew, deep down, I was trapped. This was my home. My curse. I didn't hear the figure approach, but suddenly it was right in front of me. It didn't touch me, but I could feel its presence, its gaze, heavy on me. Its mouth opened, and from it, a voice like my own echoed in the silence. You've always belonged here. You can't escape what you are. I tried to look away, to close my eyes, but it was no use. The figure's face filled my vision. It was me. It was always me. The twisted version of myself had always been in this house, always lurking just beyond the surface, waiting for me to return, to face what I had denied. Look at what you've done, the voice said, and this time it wasn't just words. It was a memory, my memory. I saw flashes of my past, my childhood, the moments I had forgotten, the things I had pushed deep into the recesses of my mind. But now they were all there, laid bare, each one a fragment of the truth I had tried to escape. The portrait had never been just a picture. It was a prison, and I had locked myself inside it. With a sudden jolt, I was back in the living room, but the room had changed. The furniture was covered in dust, the walls were cracked, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. The house had grown old, decaying just like the memory I had tried to bury. But the portrait still hung on the wall. And now, my eyes, were no longer just watching me. They were beckoning me, drawing me in, pulling me closer. I walked toward it, my feet moving without my consent, my body moving toward my fate. As I drew closer, the figure in the background of the painting reached out to me, its fingers stretching beyond the canvas, closer, closer. And then, as if I had crossed some invisible threshold, the world around me shattered. The house, the portrait, the figure, all of it disappeared. The darkness closed in around me, and in that instant, I knew. I was no longer outside. I was no longer a spectator. I had become part of the painting, part of the house, and I would never leave. Have you ever felt that there's something hidden, something lurking just beyond the edge of your awareness, waiting to be discovered? A place that was meant to remain sealed, forgotten? What if you accidentally stumbled upon it? I had always been aware of it, the door in the basement. It was never talked about, never mentioned. It was just there, old and weathered, hidden behind stacks of forgotten boxes and old furniture. My parents had never given it much attention. They never told me not to go near it, but somehow, I knew I wasn't supposed to. The door was always locked, and no matter how many times I tried to peek through the crack, the shadows beyond it seemed to stretch unnaturally, swallowing up any light that dared to approach. I remember wondering, even as a child, why it was locked in the first place. What was behind it that was so dangerous? Or was it just a simple, old room left to gather dust and secrets? Then, one evening, while I was alone in the house, something happened. It wasn't the first time I'd been in the basement. In fact, I had spent hours down there over the years, looking through old boxes, finding forgotten relics of the past. But on this particular day, I noticed something I hadn't before, a small, rusted key lying under a pile of old newspapers. I picked it up, and even in the dim light of the basement, I could see that it had a peculiar weight to it. It didn't look like any key I had ever seen before. Its shape was unusual, as though it had been made for a specific purpose. I felt an immediate unease as I turned it over in my hand, but curiosity pushed me forward. I knew what it was for. The basement door. I stood in front of it for what felt like an eternity, my hand trembling as I inserted the key into the lock. The moment it clicked open, I heard something, a low hum, almost like a distant whisper, seeping through the crack. I froze, suddenly aware that something was terribly wrong. But it was too late to turn back. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed too loud for the silence of the basement, and I stepped inside. The room was darker than I expected, the air thick with a sense of something heavy. I felt it before I saw it. The oppressive weight of the darkness in that room seemed to press against me, as if the walls were closing in. The space beyond the door seemed vast, empty, but something wasn't right about it. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I fumbled for the light switch, but the moment my fingers brushed against the wall, I felt a coldness that made my skin prickle. The switch, when I finally found it, did nothing. The room remained shrouded in darkness, as if it were rejecting the light. I stepped forward, my footfalls echoing unnervingly in the thick air. As I moved deeper into the room, my eyes began to adjust, and I noticed something strange. There was no furniture, no shelves, no boxes, nothing. Just empty space. But the floor was covered in something. Something dark. It was a thick layer of what looked like black ash. I couldn't tell how deep it went, but it covered every inch of the floor. It was as though the room had been abandoned for years, maybe longer. Yet, there was a strange, persistent feeling that this room had been disturbed recently. I could feel it in the air, in the way the dust seemed to hang, suspended in the stale air. I moved cautiously, my feet leaving deep imprints in the ash. With every step I took, the room seemed to stretch, grow larger. The edges of the room blurred, as if the space itself was shifting. I couldn't focus on anything for too long. It was as if the room didn't want me to see it clearly. But then, in the farthest corner, I saw something, a shape, sitting in the darkness. Something familiar. A chair. An old, wooden chair. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stared at it. It was the only thing in the room, and yet, it was positioned in a way that made no sense. The back of the chair faced me, but the seat was turned toward the wall, as if someone had been sitting there, waiting for me. The air grew heavier, and I found myself moving toward it, compelled by a force I couldn't resist. The closer I got, the more I could hear the faint whispering again. It was indistinct at first, but as I reached the chair, it became clearer. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a voice. A low, rasping voice, almost like a chant. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt them. I felt them in my bones, like the vibrations of an ancient presence. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and my throat constricted. I reached out to touch the back of the chair, my fingers brushing against the cold wood. And then I heard it, clearer now, like it was right behind me. Leave this place. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing. Just the suffocating darkness. The whisper had faded, but it still echoed in my mind. I turned back to the chair, but now something had changed. The seat was no longer empty. There was something, or someone, sitting there. It was hard to see, obscured by the shadow, but the shape was wrong. It was as though the shadows themselves were twisting and contorting to form it. My heart raced as I backed away, but my foot caught on something, and I stumbled, falling to the floor. The ash seemed to shift around me, swirling like it had a life of its own. I tried to scramble to my feet, but the ground felt as if it was sinking, pulling me in. Suddenly, the room began to distort, the walls bending in on themselves, and the whispering grew louder. I could no longer distinguish the voice from the sound of my own pulse, thundering in my ears. And then, as I looked up, I saw the figure in the chair. Its face was now visible, but not completely. It was blurry, like a smudge in the darkness. It leaned forward, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw its eyes, black and empty, staring right at me. "Leave this place," it whispered again, but this time its voice was not just a whisper. It was a scream. Before I could react, the room seemed to collapse around me, the walls folding inward like a collapsing tunnel. My breath caught, and I found myself running, blindly, stumbling toward the door, my hands scrambling for the knob. And just as I reached the door, I heard it again, louder than ever. "Leave." But I didn't. I didn't even know if I ever could. I barely remember how I managed to get out of that room. My mind was a blur as I stumbled back through the door, my hands trembling as I slammed it shut behind me. I could still hear the whispering, the way it echoed in the depths of my mind. It felt like the room, the darkness, had somehow followed me back into the basement. I pressed my back against the door, breathing heavily, as if trying to keep it from bursting open. But even then, I knew it wouldn't matter. The thing, whatever it was, had already left its mark on me. I stood there for what felt like hours, heart pounding in my chest, but the whispering slowly faded. My breath became more even, and I began to feel the weight of the silence pressing in around me. It was over, right? I had escaped. But even as I thought this, a cold dread crept over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly left the room behind. I turned, stumbling toward the stairs, but something made me hesitate. The basement felt different now. The air was thick, heavier than it had been before, and the silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. As I reached the top of the stairs, I glanced back. The door. It stood there, silently, like it had always been. But now, it felt more ominous. The basement door was no longer just a door, it felt like a boundary, a barrier between me and something else. Something I didn't understand. I ran up the stairs, the feeling of being watched never leaving me. I locked the door to the basement and shoved a chair in front of it. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I had to make sure it stayed shut. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. I kept imagining the dark room, its cold, suffocating air, the presence I could feel even without seeing it. The thing that had whispered to me, and the chair that had been waiting for me. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had changed in the house. It wasn't just the basement anymore. Even the rooms upstairs felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, stretching farther across the floor. The silence felt thicker. And every time I turned a corner, I would catch a glimpse of something moving, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, but it was enough to make my heart stop. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the hallway, staring at the door to the basement. I didn't even remember walking there, but there I was, staring at it as if it were calling to me. I knew I shouldn't go back down there, but curiosity gnawed at me. I had to understand what was happening, what I had seen. Without thinking, I moved toward the door, my hand shaking as I gripped the doorknob. But just as I was about to turn it, I heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A whisper. "Come back." It was the same voice, the same chilling presence from before. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. The whispering had returned, and this time it felt closer. I pulled my hand away, backing up, but the whisper didn't stop. It became louder, more insistent. "Come back." I stumbled backward, my mind racing. I had to get away. I had to leave. But as I turned to run, I saw it. In the shadows at the end of the hallway, something was moving. It wasn't just a flicker this time, it was a shape, solid and looming. It was the chair. The same old wooden chair from the dark room. It was there, at the end of the hallway, facing me, as if it had followed me out of the basement. The darkness around it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were alive, breathing, waiting. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The whispering grew louder, filling my ears until it drowned out everything else. I could feel its presence, the weight of it pressing against me, suffocating me. I had to leave. I turned and ran, but as I bolted down the stairs, I saw it again. The chair. It was no longer at the end of the hallway. Now, it was in front of the basement door. I stopped, my chest tight with fear. How? How had it gotten there? My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, to get out of the house. But I couldn't. The chair, the room, it was like they were pulling me back. I reached the bottom of the stairs, and for a moment, everything went still. The house was silent. The whispering had stopped. I slowly turned toward the basement door, but when I looked at it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The key. It was on the floor, right in front of the door. I hadn't even realized I had dropped it. But now, it was there, waiting for me. I felt a chill wash over me as I stared at it. My body was frozen in place, as though the key had locked me in place. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't want to know what was behind that door. I didn't want to see the thing that had been waiting. But the key was there, and somehow, I knew it would keep calling me back. There was no escaping the room. And there was no escaping what had been locked inside it. With shaking hands, I reached down and picked up the key. The moment I held the key in my hand, a cold shiver ran down my spine. It felt wrong, as though the metal was burning through my skin, leaving an imprint of something ancient, something sinister. I stood there, frozen, staring at it as if it had power over me, as if it could dictate my every move. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to face whatever had been locked away in that room. But as I stood there in the basement, the house around me seemed to grow even more oppressive. The walls closed in, the air grew heavier, and the whispering that had been absent for a few moments returned, soft at first, like a murmur in the distance. "Open it," it said. "Open it now." The voice was almost coaxing, as though it knew my hesitation, as though it was feeding off my fear. My fingers tightened around the key. Every part of me screamed to stop, to leave it all behind and escape. But something else, something deeper within me, pushed forward, making my hand move toward the door. I approached the basement door with slow, reluctant steps. The key felt heavier with every movement, its jagged edges pressing into my palm as though it were alive. I reached the door, my breath shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. The lock was waiting for me. It was almost mocking, like it knew what was coming, like it had been expecting me all along. I inserted the key into the lock, and it turned with a sickeningly smooth click. The sound echoed through the basement, filling the space with an unsettling resonance. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the door. There was no turning back now. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to reverberate in my bones. The room beyond was just as dark, if not darker, than I remembered. The air inside felt thick, cloying, as if something in the room had been waiting for me, breathing with anticipation. I took a hesitant step forward. My body protested, urging me to leave, but my mind couldn't resist the pull of the room. I couldn't explain why I felt the need to step inside, why the darkness felt like it was calling me, but I did. With each step I took, the space seemed to stretch further, deeper, and the shadows became more pronounced, more alive. It was as if the room itself had grown in the time I'd been away, as if it had fed on the hours of my absence and was now prepared for something or someone to enter. My feet sank into the ash on the floor again, but this time it felt different. The ash shifted, swirling like smoke, as though it had a life of its own. The coldness that had once been just an unsettling feeling now pressed against me like hands, pushing me further into the room. I moved further in, my eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness, when something caught my attention. There, in the farthest corner, I saw the same chair, the wooden chair that had been waiting for me before. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were more chairs. Not just one, but a dozen, arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward. Each one was as old and worn as the first, their surfaces smooth with age. The darkness around them seemed thicker, more oppressive, as though the shadows themselves were alive, creeping toward the center of the circle. I froze. The moment I saw the chairs, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. The room wasn't just a room. It was a trap. It was waiting for me, and it had been waiting for a long time. A low hum, like a distant chant, began to reverberate through the room. It was faint at first, just a murmur, but as I listened, it grew louder, more distinct. The whispering returned, but now it was accompanied by the sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving around me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the growing circle of chairs and the oppressive shadows closing in. "Sit," the voice whispered. "Join us." I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to run. But my legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the floor. The whispering intensified, each word cutting into my thoughts, seeping into my mind like poison. "Sit, join us." I shook my head, desperate to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the room itself was pulling me in, holding me in place. My feet moved of their own accord, and before I knew it, I found myself standing in front of one of the chairs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body betrayed me. I sat down. The moment I did, the room seemed to exhale, a long, deep breath that shook the very walls. The other chairs creaked in unison, as if acknowledging my presence, as if welcoming me. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. The shadows moved, swirling around the chairs, pressing in closer. And then, as if in a dream, I felt something touch my shoulder, cold, clammy fingers that gripped me with an unyielding force. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, oppressive room. "Welcome," the voice whispered, this time from all directions at once. It was no longer just a whisper, it was a command. "Welcome to the circle." And as I sat there, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't alone. I was never meant to leave. The room had been waiting for me, and now it had claimed me. And I would never be able to leave again. The cold fingers, which had touched my shoulder, never left. They wrapped around me, pressing against my skin like ice. I tried to pull away, but my body wouldn't move. It was as though invisible chains had bound me to the chair, forcing me to remain in place. The shadows were everywhere now, wrapping around me, crawling along the floor, up the walls, and over the ceiling. They seemed to grow thicker, pulsing with life, as if they were feeding off my fear. The whispers in the room became a cacophony, overlapping, distorting, until it felt like the very air itself was speaking. "Join us," they repeated over and over, until the words lost all meaning. My heart thudded in my chest, and my breath quickened, but I couldn't move. It was like a nightmare, one where I knew I was awake, but everything around me told me I wasn't. The presence in the room was growing, pressing in on me from all sides. I tried to look away, but the chairs, the shadows, everything around me held me in place. The cold fingers tightened. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. I wanted to run, but my legs were rooted to the ground. And then I realized this was the trap. This was the purpose of the room. It wasn't just about locking away something dark and ancient. It was about keeping it in the dark until someone came looking. And now that I had opened the door, now that I had sat in the chair, it was my turn. I wasn't the first. I wasn't the last. A new voice broke through the whispers, sharp and cold. Look. The shadows parted, revealing something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the circle, beneath the chairs, the floor had begun to crack. A deep, black void opened up beneath it, swirling with an unsettling energy. The floor seemed to tremble, and the air grew colder still, until I felt like I was trapped in the belly of a frozen beast. The cracks spread, and through the dark hole, something began to emerge. At first, it was a shape, dark, indistinct, like smoke rising from a fire. But then it began to form, to take shape, to become something more. A figure, its edges jagged and undefined, hovered just above the ground. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, twisted limbs that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness above. I couldn't see its face, but I felt it. I felt its eyes. It was watching me. The room seemed to warp around me as the figure grew larger, its presence overwhelming. The whispers faded into silence, and for a brief moment, the only sound I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then, as if in response, the other chairs creaked. They shifted. They were no longer empty. The room, which had been silent for so long, now hummed with a dark, pulsing energy. The figures in the chairs were no longer just shadows. They were real, solid, and they were watching me. There were people in the chairs, all staring at me with wide, vacant eyes, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and despair. But they weren't alive. They couldn't be. I turned my head, my mind reeling with horror. I wanted to scream, but my mouth wouldn't move. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped. The dark figure loomed over me, and the shadows around me pressed in even closer. The whispers returned, louder than before, swirling around me, drowning me in their insistent calls. Join us. The words weren't just whispers anymore. They were commands, reverberating through my skull, crawling into my mind. They were suffocating me. The air thickened once more. It wasn't just cold now, it was suffocating. Like I was drowning in the very space around me. I could feel the pressure in my chest building, the panic rising within me, but I couldn't move, couldn't escape. I was locked in place, anchored to that cursed chair by something more than fear. Something more than magic. The figure stepped closer. Its presence, overwhelming and suffocating, seemed to suck the light from the room, plunging it deeper into darkness. The shadows were no longer just shadows, they were alive, writhing, reaching out for me. Join us, the voice repeated, now just a low growl. It was then that I saw it. A small movement, barely perceptible in the darkness, just beneath the figure's outstretched arm. The chair. The one next to me. It was empty. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I couldn't look away. The space in the chair was vacant, and something in the back of my mind told me that it was meant for me. The room, this place, this circle, wasn't just a trap. It was a transformation, a calling. And now, I was the one being called. As the figure stepped forward, its form began to shift, twisting into something grotesque, monstrous. Its face remained hidden, but I could feel its eyes, feel them boring into me, claiming me. I realized what I had to do. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't scream. I could only follow. I stood, slowly, my legs shaking, my heart racing, and I walked toward the empty chair. Each step felt like it was pulling me closer to the darkness. Each step felt like it was taking me farther from the world I had known. I sat. And the room, the circle, the shadows, they closed in. The figure, now standing behind me, whispered one last time, "Welcome home." The moment I sat down, everything changed. At first, I didn't realize it. The room around me felt the same, cold, dark, suffocating. The figure loomed, its presence undeniable, pressing on me from all sides. But then, something shifted. It wasn't the room. It wasn't the figure. It was me. I could feel my body changing. The air that had been so thick with fear now seemed to invade my lungs like ice, freezing me from the inside out. My fingers twitched as though something had taken root inside me, something that had never been there before. I felt it crawling beneath my skin, a presence that was not my own. The shadows, once oppressive, now felt like they were flowing through my veins. The whispers grew louder. "Join us," they repeated, but now the voices had faces. Faces that I knew. I turned my head, and there, in the chairs surrounding me, were the same vacant eyes. The same people who had been sitting before. Only now, I could see them clearly, like a fog had lifted. And what I saw, what I recognized, made my blood freeze. They were my family. I could see the familiar features, the faces I had grown up with. My mother, my father, my sister. But they were different. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, their faces frozen in expressions of fear and despair. They were trapped, like me, like us. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My heart pounded in my chest, and I realized the horrible truth. This wasn't just a room. It wasn't just a circle of shadows. It was a prison. A prison for those who had entered, those who had dared to open the door. I wasn't just a witness. I was becoming a part of it. I looked back at the figure. It stood behind me now, closer than ever. Its form was massive, its edges still jagged, shifting, like smoke caught in a storm. I could feel its presence more than I could see it, an overwhelming weight pressing down on me. "Welcome," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural sound. "You are one of us now." I wanted to scream. I wanted to claw at my skin, to tear away whatever it was that had taken hold of me, but my body wouldn't respond. The shadows were inside me. They had seeped into my soul, wrapped themselves around my thoughts. I wasn't just trapped in this room. I was becoming part of it. I looked around, my gaze darting from one face to another. My family, my own flesh and blood, stared back at me, their faces expressions of silent horror, as though they, too, knew the truth. They had been here before me. They had sat in a circle, just like I had. They had opened the door. They had become part of the shadows. I wasn't the first. I wouldn't be the last. The chair beneath me creaked. I could feel it now, the warmth of the seat beneath me, and yet it felt wrong. Cold, unyielding. Something shifted, pulling at my insides. My chest tightened, as if the shadows were squeezing the life out of me. I could feel them, crawling under my skin, eating away at me, making me less human, less real. And then, just as suddenly, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent. But the silence was deafening. It pressed against my eardrums, filling the space with an unearthly weight. I could hear my own breath, ragged and shallow, as if I were drowning in the very air. The figure stepped forward. "Now, you understand," it said, its voice so close that I could feel its words brush against my skin. "The circle has no beginning. It has no end. It is eternal. And now, you are a part of it." I wanted to cry out, to beg for mercy, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. The air was too thick, too heavy. And the figure, towering over me, seemed to grow larger, more imposing. The shadows were swallowing me whole. "Join us," it repeated, its voice now a low, insistent growl. "Join us, and never leave." And then I saw it. I saw the truth, clear and undeniable. The shadows weren't just shadows. They were memories. The faces in the chairs, my family, hadn't been trapped here just by force. They had chosen to sit. They had chosen to be part of this eternal circle. And now, I was one of them. My soul had been bound to the darkness, my mind consumed by the endless whispers, and my body was now just another empty vessel in the circle. The door had never been the trap. It had been the invitation. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of eternity settle on me. The chair was no longer just a chair. It was my prison, my tomb. And there, in the darkness, I realized one horrifying truth. I was never meant to leave. Not now. Not ever. Have you ever stumbled upon something that changed your life forever? I did, one rainy afternoon in the dusty corners of an old library. The world outside was cloaked in gray, and the rhythmic tapping of raindrops against the windows created a perfect backdrop for a day of exploration. I loved losing myself among the shelves, where every book whispered secrets of its own. As I wandered deeper into the stacks, a peculiar object caught my eye. It was a calendar, bound in faded leather, its pages yellowed and worn. Unlike the others, this one seemed to shimmer slightly, as if alive. Curious, I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the embossed numbers that marked the days of the month. The moment I opened it, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The dates shifted before my eyes, rearranging themselves into new formations, while ink flowed like liquid silver, writing out events that were yet to come. My heart raced as I read the dates, familiar names, places I knew, and events that would happen in just a few hours. I felt an inexplicable thrill and dread mingled in the pit of my stomach. At first, it seemed like a harmless curiosity. I left the library, clutching the calendar tightly, eager to test its powers. But as the hours passed, I began to notice the unsettling truth behind its predictions. The first entry I read was innocuous, a birthday party for someone named Alex. I smiled, thinking it a coincidence. But when I received a message from Alex, reminding me of the party, my smile faltered. Then came the next entry, a car accident on the corner of Maple and Fifth. I dismissed it as mere chance until I heard the sirens blaring later that evening, a haunting echo that sent chills through my body. Each new prediction was accompanied by a sense of foreboding. It was as if the calendar wasn't just recording events, it was orchestrating them. As I fell asleep that night, clutching the calendar, the shadows in my room grew longer, darker. The familiar shapes of my furniture twisted into unsettling forms, and the silence felt heavier, filled with whispers I couldn't quite catch. I dismissed it all as imagination, but deep down, an unsettling thought nagged at me. What if this calendar held power beyond my understanding? I awoke the next morning, drenched in sweat, and the calendar lay open beside me, its pages fluttering as if caught in an unseen breeze. I froze, my eyes drawn to today's date. The ink shimmered ominously, the events marked in bold, threatening letters. The first entry chilled me to the core, the reckoning at the library. I remembered the strange way the librarian had looked at me when I had left, as if she knew something I didn't. Panic gripped me. I had to get back there, to understand what this calendar was truly capable of. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something far worse than I could imagine. As I hurried through the town, familiar sights transformed into foreboding landscapes. The chirping of birds became ominous caws, and laughter echoed like a distant cry. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the library, a looming figure against the darkening sky. The once inviting building now felt like a prison, holding secrets I was not ready to uncover. Stepping inside, I was greeted by a heavy silence, the kind that suffocates. The air felt thick, and I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. I glanced at the calendar in my hand. Its pages began to tremble, and I felt an unseen force tugging at me, urging me to read on. What awaited me was a reality I could never have anticipated, a world where time twisted and danger lurked in every corner, all because of a calendar that seemed to have a life of its own. The library, once a sanctuary, now felt like a den of shadows. As I stepped deeper inside, the familiar rows of books transformed into dark sentinels, watching me with silent judgment. The calendar burned in my hand, its weight a constant reminder of the responsibility I never asked for. My breath quickened as I made my way to the history section, where I hoped to find answers. I flipped through the pages of the calendar, each entry more foreboding than the last. A storm breeze at noon, one read, and I could almost hear the low rumble of thunder in the distance, promising chaos. An unexpected visitor will arrive. My mind raced with possibilities. Who or what would come, and what did they want? I reached the history section, the air thick with dust and the scent of aged paper. As I scanned the shelves, the words "The Reckoning" echoed in my mind. What could it mean? My thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise, a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. I turned, expecting to see someone behind me, but found only the empty aisles stretching into the shadows. The whisper grew louder, now resembling a chant echoing off the walls. "You should not have taken it," it seemed to say. A chill enveloped me. I clutched the calendar tightly, feeling the tremors of uncertainty ripple through me. I had to confront this, whatever it was. I rushed to the main reading area, where a long table lay bathed in soft light. My heart raced as I opened the calendar again, desperate for guidance. I flipped to the next date, my fingers trembling. The reckoning at the library, first blood will be spilled. Panic surged through me. I scanned the room, the shadows shifting as if alive. The once familiar space now felt like a maze of uncertainty. My mind raced through all the possible interpretations of first blood. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was coming for me, or worse, for someone I cared about. Suddenly, the front door creaked open. I turned, heart pounding, as a figure stepped inside. It was the librarian, her face pale, eyes wide with an urgency that sent another wave of dread through me. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and trembling. You've awakened something. Before I could respond, the air around us changed. The temperature dropped, and I felt an oppressive force pushing against me. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that danced like phantoms. The librarian moved closer, her gaze darting around the room. We need to leave. Now. I followed her, but as we moved toward the exit, the calendar slipped from my fingers and landed open on the table. The pages fluttered violently, as if caught in a gale. The librarian froze, her face a mask of horror. No. It's too late. Just then, the lights flickered out completely, plunging us into darkness. I could hear the sound of rushing air, a low growl that reverberated through the silence. Fear tightened its grip on me as I instinctively reached for the calendar, its pages pulsing with energy. "Don't read it," the librarian shouted, but it was too late. I found my eyes drawn to the open page, and I could barely comprehend the words that appeared. "An entity will rise, seeking the one who disturbed its slumber." A sudden crash echoed through the library, sending a jolt through my body. The floor shook, and books tumbled from the shelves, creating a cacophony of chaos. I clutched the calendar tightly, my heart racing. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices urging me to flee, to hide. "Follow me," the librarian yelled, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the back of the library. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the table where the calendar lay, its pages now glowing eerily in the dim light. I knew I had to leave, but something inside me urged me to stay, to confront whatever was coming. The librarian led me through a maze of stacks, but as we turned a corner, the growling intensified, echoing through the narrow aisles. I could feel the presence closing in, something dark and powerful, a force that thrived on fear. My instincts screamed at me to run, yet I felt an overwhelming curiosity pulling me back. We reached a door marked staff only. The librarian opened it, and I was met with a staircase leading down into darkness. "We can hide down there," she insisted, glancing back nervously. But something inside me resisted the idea. What if the calendar had answers? "Wait," I called, pulling away from her grasp. "I need to understand what's happening." "The calendar, it's connected." Her eyes widened in fear. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Please, we need to go." But before I could respond, the growling escalated, resonating through the library like thunder. A dark figure materialized at the end of the aisle, its shape flickering in and out of focus. I felt my heart drop as I realized we were no longer alone. The reckoning had begun. The air crackled with tension as the figure loomed closer, a shadow manifesting from the darkness, shifting and swirling like smoke. My instincts screamed at me to flee, yet I stood frozen, caught between fear and the insatiable urge to uncover the truth of the calendar. The librarian pushed me back, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't stay here," she urged, her voice breaking. "You don't understand. It's not just a calendar, it's a gateway." The growling intensified, reverberating through the very walls of the library. My heart raced as I peered into the growing darkness. "What do you mean a gateway?" I asked, desperation lacing my voice. "It brings forth what was lost, what was forgotten," she replied, glancing back toward the shadow, which seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. "It awakens the entities trapped in the folds of time. We need to hide." Before I could respond, the shadow surged forward, a mass of swirling darkness with eyes that glowed like embers. The growling morphed into a deafening roar that shook the shelves around us. Books flew off their perches, scattering like leaves in a storm. With a surge of adrenaline, I sprinted after the librarian down the narrow staircase. The dim light flickered above us, casting ominous shadows as we descended into the unknown. Each step echoed like a heartbeat, amplifying the sense of urgency. I could still hear the growl behind us, relentless and hungry. We reached a small room at the bottom of the stairs, lined with shelves filled with old, dusty tomes. The librarian slammed the door shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We'll be safe here for a moment," she panted, pressing her back against the door, as if trying to hold the darkness at bay. I glanced around the room, my eyes drawn to a large, ornate book resting on a pedestal. Its cover was embossed with symbols I didn't recognize, shimmering faintly in the low light. "What's that?" I asked, pointing. "It's a repository of knowledge," she replied, her voice trembling. "It may hold the answers we need to confront what's after us. But we don't have time to read it." I hesitated, torn between survival and curiosity. The calendar was still clutched tightly in my hands, and I felt an urgent need to consult it again. The librarian's eyes narrowed in fear. "Don't. The more you engage with it, the stronger it becomes." Ignoring her warning, I opened the calendar, its pages flipping wildly until they landed on today's date. "The Reckoning," it read again, but this time new words appeared, shimmering ominously. "To confront the dark, one must sacrifice the light." A sinking feeling washed over me. "What does that mean?" I whispered, fear creeping in. "It means you'll have to give something up," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Something precious. It's the only way to close the gateway." As I processed her words, the growling from outside grew louder, the door shaking as if something powerful was attempting to break through. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. What was I willing to sacrifice? "I can't let this thing out," I murmured, feeling the gravity of my situation. "But what if it wants me? What if I'm the sacrifice?" The librarian's eyes widened. "It feeds on fear, on doubt. If you confront it with strength, it may back down. But we need to prepare." "Prepare for what?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "Whatever it is, it's coming for you," she said, her voice low. "We have to find a way to banish it back." The growling intensified, and I could see shadows slipping under the door. Panic rose within me. "What do we do?" "Focus on the light within you," she instructed, taking a deep breath. "We must create a barrier. If we can channel our energy, we might stand a chance." We stood together, facing the door, and I closed my eyes, summoning every ounce of courage I could muster. I remembered the warmth of sunlight on my face, the laughter of friends, and the moments that made life beautiful. With each thought, I felt a flicker of light grow within me, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. The door rattled violently, and the growl morphed into a screech, sending vibrations through the room. "Now!" the librarian shouted, and we placed our hands together, forming a makeshift barrier. "Leave us!" I shouted, my voice echoing with newfound strength. "You have no power here." For a moment, silence fell. The darkness paused, as if caught off guard. But then, with a deafening roar, it surged forward again, more furious than ever. I felt the shadows clawing at the edges of my mind, whispering doubts and fears. "Focus," the librarian urged, her face etched with determination. I dug deeper, picturing the light expanding, forming a shield around us. The shadows writhed, hissing in frustration. The growling turned to a desperate scream, reverberating through the air. I felt the pressure building, the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. My heart raced as I thought of everything I stood to lose, the friends I loved, the life I cherished. I couldn't let it end here. With a final surge of energy, I shouted, "You cannot have me. You are nothing." The light burst forth, blinding in its intensity, pushing back against the shadow with a force I didn't know I possessed. As the light enveloped us, I could feel the dark figure recoil, its form dissipating like smoke in the wind. A low, anguished wail filled the air, and for a moment everything was still. But just as quickly as the calm arrived, I felt a crack in my resolve. The light flickered, and with it, the shadows began to close in again. The calendar, still open in my hand, began to pulse with urgency. I realized that the battle was far from over. The light I had summoned flickered like a candle in a storm, struggling against the relentless darkness that threatened to engulf us once more. I felt a deep sense of urgency. The entity was not gone, it was merely regrouping, waiting for a moment of weakness. "Focus. We need to keep the light strong," the librarian urged, her voice strained as she leaned into our combined energy. I could feel the warmth between us, but it was waning, and I could sense the darkness lurking just outside the door, biding its time. "We can't let it in," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "What else can we do?" She glanced at the ornate book on the pedestal, its cover glimmering with ancient symbols. "The book may have the answers we need. If it contains knowledge about the entity, we can learn how to banish it for good. But we have to act quickly." With a nod, I reluctantly stepped away from our barrier, my heart racing. I felt the shadows pressing against my back, threatening to pull me into their depths. "I'll grab it," I said, steeling myself. I dashed toward the pedestal, each step feeling like wading through thick mud. The moment I reached the book, I felt a surge of cold air whip past me, causing the hairs on the back of my neck to stand on end. I reached for the cover, my fingers trembling. The librarian called out, "Hurry! We don't have much time." I flipped the book open, its pages filled with intricate illustrations and arcane text. My heart sank as I skimmed the words, each line seemingly more cryptic than the last. But one passage caught my eye, written in bold, dark ink, "To vanquish the shadow, one must summon the light of truth." "What does that mean?" I asked, my mind racing. "It means we have to confront the reality of our fears," she said, urgency in her tone. "Face what the shadow represents in us, our doubts, our regrets. Only then can we harness the light needed to push it back." The door trembled violently as the entity outside roared again, its voice a cacophony of anguish and rage. "It's coming!" I shouted, panic rising. "Close your eyes and think of your fears," the librarian instructed. "Visualize them as shadows. Then, imagine the light overcoming them." I squeezed my eyes shut, taking a deep breath. My mind flooded with memories, moments of failure, loss, and isolation. Each fear felt like a weight on my chest, threatening to pull me under. But I held onto the flicker of light within me, channeling it into a warmth that pushed against the darkness surrounding my thoughts. "Let it go," the librarian encouraged, her voice steady. "Embrace the light and let it shine through." As I focused on my fears, I began to visualize them as dark shapes. I pictured the regret of missed opportunities, the sorrow of lost friends, the loneliness that sometimes wrapped itself around me like a heavy cloak. But within that darkness, I could see tiny pinpricks of light illuminating the corners of my mind. With each breath, I concentrated on those lights, feeling them grow stronger. "I will not be defined by my fears," I whispered to myself. "I am more than my doubts." Suddenly, the door burst open with a deafening crash, and the dark figure surged into the room, a writhing mass of shadows with eyes like burning coals. It lunged toward us, a howling tempest of rage and despair. "Now!" the librarian yelled. "Channel that light." I opened my eyes just in time to see the figure rush at us. In a surge of adrenaline, I thrust my hands forward, focusing all my energy into a brilliant beam of light that shot from my palms. The glow illuminated the room, pushing back against the shadows, the light so bright it almost blinded me. The dark entity recoiled, howling in fury as my light collided with it. The ground shook beneath us, and I felt the force of the confrontation reverberate through my bones. The shadows writhed, trying to swallow the light, but it pushed through, relentless and fierce. Together, the librarian shouted, and I could see her summoning her own light, a radiant aura forming around her. Our energies intertwined, creating a powerful wave that surged toward the entity. The shadows screamed, a sound that pierced through the air and rattled the very foundation of the library. As the light expanded, I could see the dark figure beginning to lose its form, unraveling like smoke in a breeze. "Focus on the truth," the librarian urged. "What do you want to tell it?" I closed my eyes again, reaching deep within myself. "I am not afraid of you," I shouted, my voice ringing with conviction. "You will not control me. I am stronger than you think." The light blazed brighter, and the shadows began to shatter, crumbling under the intensity of our combined energy. I could feel the warmth of hope spreading through me, a sensation I hadn't felt in so long. The entity writhed, its form flickering and collapsing, but I knew it wasn't enough. I had to dig deeper, confront the core of my fears. I embraced my light. "I will not let you win," I cried, pouring everything I had into the burst of illumination. With one final surge, the light engulfed the dark entity, and I felt the overwhelming weight of its darkness lift, replaced by a sense of clarity and purpose. The entity let out one last anguished scream before it vanished into nothingness, the echoes of its rage fading away. Silence enveloped us, and I dropped to my knees, panting heavily. The room felt different now, lighter. The oppressive shadows had dissipated, replaced by a warm glow that seemed to fill every corner. The librarian stood beside me, her expression a mix of relief and awe. "You did it," she said, breathless. "You faced the darkness and conquered it." I looked at the open book, its pages now still and calm, the chaos of earlier replaced by a serene presence. "But it's not over, is it?" I asked, feeling a sense of unease. "No," she replied, shaking her head. "This was just one battle. There will be more. The calendar may have given you a glimpse of what lies ahead, but you have the strength to face it." As I glanced at the calendar, still resting on the pedestal, I felt a strange sense of connection. It was a tool, a guide, but now I understood its true nature. It didn't dictate my fate, it revealed the choices before me. "We need to go," the librarian said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "There's much more to uncover." I nodded, rising to my feet, determined to face whatever came next. Together, we stepped back into the light, ready to confront the future, one day at a time. The library felt different as we emerged from the depths of that hidden room. The air was lighter, free from the suffocating presence of the shadow that had haunted us. Yet, even with the calm surrounding us, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. "Where do we go from here?" I asked the librarian, my voice steadier than I felt. She looked at me, a mixture of pride and concern etched on her face. "The calendar has shown you the way, but it's up to you to choose how to proceed. You have faced darkness and emerged stronger. But remember, it's not just about fighting. It's also about understanding. I nodded, absorbing her words. The calendar wasn't merely a harbinger of doom, it was a tool for insight and growth. I could see now that each entry held lessons, not just predictions. As we made our way through the library, I could see the familiar space transformed. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. The shelves, once foreboding, now felt like guardians of knowledge. The librarian paused in front of a large window, gazing out at the town beyond. "There's a world out there that needs understanding," she said. "You've experienced something most people cannot fathom. You have a gift." "A gift?" I echoed, glancing at her with skepticism. "Yes. You can see what others cannot. You can help guide them, help them face their own shadows." Her eyes sparkled with conviction. "But you must be careful. With power comes responsibility." I took a deep breath, contemplating her words. What if I make a mistake? What if I can't help them? "Every journey involves uncertainty," she replied gently. "But remember, you have faced your fears. You can do it again. Start small. Help those around you. Use the calendar to gain insight, but don't let it dictate your choices. Forge your own path." I felt a surge of determination swell within me. "You're right. I can't run away from this. I need to embrace it." We left the library, stepping into the bright afternoon light. The world outside was vibrant and alive, yet a tinge of unease still lingered. The events of the past few days had opened my eyes to the complexities of existence, the intertwining of light and dark. "Let's visit some of the people in town," the librarian suggested. "There are many who could benefit from your insight. They may be facing challenges you can help with." As we walked through the streets, I felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. I noticed the little things I had overlooked before: the woman sitting alone on a bench, her eyes cast down, the child chasing after a ball but hesitating before crossing the street, the elderly man staring off into the distance, lost in thought. Each of them carried their own shadows, and I felt a growing sense of responsibility to reach out. We approached the woman on the bench first. She looked up as we neared, surprise flickering across her face. "Hello," I said gently. "Are you okay?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "Just thinking about things. Life can be overwhelming sometimes." I felt a connection stir within me, a recognition of my own struggles. "I understand. Sometimes it helps to share those thoughts. I've been through some difficult times myself." The woman's expression softened, and she began to open up about her worries, her job, her family, the feeling of being lost. I listened intently, allowing her to share her fears, reminding her that she wasn't alone. After a while, she smiled, a flicker of hope returning to her eyes. "Thank you for listening. It feels good to talk." Encouraged, I turned to the librarian, who smiled back at me, pride evident in her gaze. We continued through town, speaking to others, offering support, and listening to their stories. Each encounter deepened my understanding of the human experience, illuminating the struggles we all shared. As evening descended, I felt a sense of fulfillment. The darkness that had once threatened to consume me had transformed into a source of strength. Each person I reached out to was another reminder of the light we could share. When we finally returned to the library, I felt a shift within me. The calendar lay on the table, still open to today's date. I approached it, feeling a sense of reverence. I could feel its energy pulsing softly, a reminder of the journey I had embarked upon. "What's next?" I asked the librarian, my heart racing with curiosity. She stepped beside me, glancing at the calendar. "Now, it's about understanding your role in this world. There will be challenges ahead, and not every shadow can be banished. But remember, you can learn from them. They will guide you, just as the light does." I nodded, contemplating her words. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed new entries appearing, suggestions of community events, reminders to connect with others, opportunities to share what I had learned. It was as if the calendar was evolving alongside me, offering guidance on my new path. "Embrace the unknown," the librarian encouraged. "This is your journey, and I will be here to help you navigate it." With newfound determination, I closed the calendar, feeling its warmth radiate through my hands. I wasn't just a passive observer anymore. I was a participant in a larger story, one where light and dark intertwined, teaching me valuable lessons along the way. As I looked out through the library windows at the twinkling lights of the town, I felt a surge of hope. The world was full of shadows, but I was ready to face them, one day at a time. Together, we could find the light. Have you ever wondered what would happen if time itself became your enemy? I never thought about it until the day my old clock began to tick strangely. It was an antique, a family heirloom that had always kept perfect time until recently. I had just moved into my late grandfather's house, filled with memories and whispers of the past. It was a place steeped in history, but to me, it felt more like a tomb than a home. The wooden floors creaked beneath my weight, and the walls seemed to close in on me, filled with fading photographs and stories I didn't know. On that fateful afternoon, I sat in my grandfather's study, the musty air thick around me. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing lazily. The clock on the wall hung just above the fireplace, its face a swirl of gold and silver, hands frozen at a time I couldn't recall. I leaned closer, curious about its condition. Suddenly, a soft ticking sound broke the silence. My heart raced. I straightened up, half expecting my grandfather to appear, smiling as if he had just stepped out of the past. But the room remained empty, echoing with the creaks of the house settling. I shrugged it off, dismissing the sound as a figment of my imagination. Yet, as the day wore on, the ticking grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of my heart, a pulse that drew me in. I approached the clock again, my curiosity piqued. As I reached for the pendulum, the clock chimed unexpectedly, sending a shiver down my spine. The hands began to move, slowly at first, then faster. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. Before I could process what was happening, the clock struck midnight. In an instant, everything around me blurred. The study faded into a swirl of colors and sounds, like a painting melting under heat. My stomach twisted, and I felt as if I were being pulled apart. And then, just as suddenly, the world snapped back into focus. I found myself standing in the same study, but everything felt different. The air was thicker, charged with an electric energy. The clock hung silently on the wall, its hands now pointing at a different time. Confused, I looked around the room. The furniture had changed, the once familiar space transformed into something both strange and unsettling. In the corner stood a group of people, their clothes anachronistic, styles I had only seen in history books. They were engaged in animated conversation, their voices filled with urgency. I blinked, trying to make sense of it all. "Did you hear it?" one of them exclaimed, a young woman with hair tied back in a bun. The clock is ticking again. My heart raced as I took a step closer, unsure of whether to reveal myself or remain hidden. The group glanced around, sensing a presence but unable to see me. I felt like a ghost in my own home, trapped between time and reality. Suddenly, a man in a dark suit turned, his eyes locking onto mine. A chill ran down my spine as I realized he could see me. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice filled with both curiosity and suspicion. I'm just visiting," I stammered, feeling more like an intruder than a guest in my own life. The room went silent, and they exchanged glances, uncertainty filling the air. "You shouldn't be here," the woman warned, her tone shifting to one concern. "The clock brings danger." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. "The clock doesn't just tell time. It pulls people into moments that should never be revisited," the man explained, his voice low. "Once it starts, it's nearly impossible to stop it." My mind raced, trying to comprehend their words. The clock had changed everything, and now I was part of a narrative I didn't understand. Just as fear began to take hold, the clock chimed again, louder this time, vibrating through my bones. The scene around me began to blur once more, and I felt that same twisting sensation, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. "No!" I shouted, but the sound was lost as the world around me dissolved into darkness. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in my grandfather's study. The clock hung silently on the wall, its hands frozen at the same time. I stumbled back, heart racing. I was alone, yet the echoes of the other time still resonated within me. What had just happened? I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to grasp the enormity of it all. The clock had transported me to another time, another place, and I was left with a deep sense of foreboding. As the sun began to set outside, shadows crept into the corners of the room. I could still hear the faint echoes of the people, their warnings lingering in the air. This clock was not just a relic of the past, it was a portal, and I could feel the weight of its magic pressing down on me. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. I had unlocked something far more profound than I could have ever imagined, and with it came a lurking danger that would change my life forever. The clock remained silent, but its presence felt heavier than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line, stepping into a realm where time twisted and turned unpredictably. I sat on the edge of my grandfather's old desk, staring at the clock as if it might offer some explanation for what had just occurred. The room was now dimly lit, shadows creeping along the walls. I could hear the distant rustle of leaves outside, the wind whispering secrets I couldn't grasp. Despite the stillness, a sense of urgency pulsed within me. I had to know more about this clock, what power it held, and why it had chosen me. I decided to investigate. Rummaging through the drawers of the desk, I found an assortment of old papers and dusty trinkets, relics of my grandfather's life. Among them was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn. I opened it, hoping it would provide clues. The first few pages were filled with his meticulous handwriting, detailing mundane things, appointments, notes on his garden, thoughts on the weather. But as I flipped further, the tone changed. "There is a peculiar clock in my study," one entry read. "It has begun to tick at odd intervals. Each time it stops, I feel a pull, a sensation that something is wrong. I fear it may be more than just a timepiece." My heart raced as I continued reading. The journal detailed encounters similar to mine, visions of the past, conversations with people long gone, and a feeling of being trapped in cycles of time. My grandfather had known about the clock's power, but had he been able to control it? I felt a chill as I read a later entry. I believe the clock is a gateway, but a dangerous one. I must find a way to break its hold before it consumes me. The last entry was unfinished, a mere scrawl of words that trailed off into chaos. I closed the journal, a sense of dread settling over me. My grandfather had feared the clock, and now it seemed that fear was inherited. As night enveloped the house, I sat in silence, the only sound being the soft ticking of the clock, now seemingly innocuous yet ominous. The room felt alive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Then, without warning, the clock chimed again. Panic surged through me. I had to escape. But where could I go? The room around me blurred, and I was pulled into the familiar vortex, the same twisting sensation engulfing me. When the world reformed, I found myself in the study once more, but everything felt off. The air was colder, and the furniture was draped in white sheets, like remnants of a forgotten time. I felt a sinking dread in my chest as I stepped forward. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the eerie silence. There was no response, only the soft creaking of the house. I approached the clock, its hands still ticking steadily. But as I reached for it, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman in a long dress, her features obscured by the dim light. "Who are you?" I asked, my heart pounding. She stepped closer, her face becoming clearer. It was a reflection of a woman I barely recognized, my grandmother. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice a haunting whisper. "The clock has chosen you, and it is not safe." "Chosen me for what?" I demanded, confusion mingling with fear. "To relive moments, to see what was, but never to change it. Time is not a thread to be unraveled. It is a tapestry that holds us all together. If you pull at one thread, the whole fabric may tear." Her warning echoed in my mind. I had to find a way to stop this cycle. "What can I do?" I pleaded. "Break the clock's hold," she replied, her expression grave. "But be wary, the more you delve into the past, the more you risk losing yourself to it." Just then, the clock chimed again, interrupting our conversation. The sound reverberated, filling the room with a chilling resonance. I felt the pull, the familiar vortex forming around me. "Don't forget who you are," she shouted, her figure beginning to dissolve into the shadows. "You must remember." Before I could respond, the world blurred once more. I gasped as I found myself back in the study, heart racing, the clock's hands now pointing to a time long before my birth. I felt disoriented, as if I had traveled not only through time but through layers of my own existence. The clock was relentless, and I could feel its power threatening to consume me. I needed answers, fast. I decided to confront the clock. I approached it, standing face to face with the old, ornate timepiece. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, as if the clock could hear my plea. As I spoke, the ticking grew louder, almost deafening. In a moment of clarity, I realized the clock was a reflection of my own fears, my past mistakes, and the threads of time that bound me. With a surge of determination, I grabbed the clock's pendulum, feeling the cold metal against my skin. "You will not control me," I shouted, pulling it down with all my strength. The clock shuddered violently, its ticking escalating to a frantic pace. The walls began to tremble, and shadows danced around me, forming twisted shapes that clawed at the edges of my vision. I had to break free. But just as I felt a surge of power within me, the clock struck once more, and I was pulled into the darkness again, leaving behind the study, the warnings, and the shadow of my grandmother's face. What awaited me next? I had no idea. All I knew was that the clock would not give up easily, and neither would I. Time was unraveling, and I was at the center of its storm. I tumbled through the darkness, feeling the weight of countless moments pressing against me. When the world finally snapped back into focus, I found myself in the same study, but now it was bathed in a soft golden light. The clock stood proudly on the wall, its hands still ticking, as if taunting me. This time, however, I was not alone. Around the room were people dressed in clothing from a bygone era, men in tailored suits, women in elegant dresses, all engaged in animated conversation. Their laughter echoed, a ghostly reminder of life once lived. But as I stepped closer, the joy in their eyes faded into confusion. They looked at me as if I were an intruder, a specter haunting their gathering. "Who are you?" a man with a bowler hat asked, stepping forward. His eyes were sharp, piercing through the illusion of time. I'm just visiting," I stammered, trying to regain my composure. The group exchanged glances, uncertainty swirling in the air. "This is not a place for visitors," the woman in a long dress replied, her voice filled with an unsettling calm. "You are not of this time. Neither are you." I shot back, desperation creeping into my tone. "You're just echoes of the past." Their expressions shifted, a flicker of recognition passing between them. "We are bound here," the man with the bowler hat replied, his voice heavy with sorrow. "We are remnants of moments lost, and you have disrupted the balance." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Disrupted? How was I supposed to fix this? I had been thrust into a world I didn't understand, and now I was part of it. The clock on the wall chimed again, the sound resonating like a warning bell. The room began to shake, and the laughter turned into screams. The once lively figures transformed into shadows, their outlines flickering like candles in the wind. "No!" I shouted, panic rising within me. "What's happening?" "The clock is unstable," the woman cried, reaching for me. "You must leave before it pulls you in." Before I could react, a swirling vortex erupted from the clock, engulfing everything in its path. I felt the pull of time tugging at my very being, the fabric of reality unraveling around me. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact, and then darkness consumed me once more. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in my grandfather's study, the familiar surroundings offering a fleeting sense of comfort. But that comfort quickly faded as I noticed the clock was now ticking backward. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "No, not again," I whispered, panic surging in my veins. As I stumbled back, I heard a voice, soft, echoing through the stillness. "You must confront the clock, not flee from it." I turned to see my grandfather's ghostly figure standing by the window, the light filtering through him like mist. "Grandfather!" I gasped, my heart pounding. "How do I stop this?" "It is not just a clock, it is a guardian of time," he said, his voice steady. "You must understand its purpose. It reflects the chaos of your heart, the fears you have yet to face." "But I don't understand," I cried, frustration boiling over. "How can I face something I don't even comprehend?" "By confronting your past," he replied, his gaze penetrating. "Each time you travel, you revisit a piece of yourself. Do not run from it. Embrace it." The clock chimed again, this time resonating like a heartbeat, pulsing with urgency. I felt the darkness closing in, the edges of my reality fraying. "Remember who you are," my grandfather's voice echoed, fading into the background as the world began to dissolve around me once more. I braced myself, knowing I had to confront the clock. I could no longer be a passive participant in this twisted game of time. I had to face my fears, my memories, and the choices that had led me here. As the darkness faded and I landed in yet another iteration of the study, I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This time, the room was dimly lit and the air felt heavy with tension. I stepped toward the clock, its hands still ticking backward, and whispered, "I am ready to face you." With that declaration, the clock chimed violently, and I felt myself being pulled into a new memory, my past. I found myself in a dimly lit room, the smell of dust and old wood surrounding me. It was my childhood bedroom, filled with toys I hadn't seen in years. A younger version of myself sat on the floor, scribbling in a notebook. The innocence of that moment washed over me, but the joy quickly faded as I noticed a shadow lurking in the corner. The shadow took shape, forming into a figure I recognized all too well, my father. He stood there, a frown on his face, disappointment radiating from him. "You need to focus," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "You'll never amount to anything if you don't take this seriously." The hurt washed over me, memories flooding back of moments where I felt inadequate, the burden of expectations suffocating me. I had spent years trying to escape that shadow, to prove my worth. "No!" I shouted, stepping forward. "I'm not that scared child anymore. I'm not defined by your expectations." As I spoke, the room shifted, the colors fading into shades of gray. The clock in the corner chimed loudly, its hands continuing to move backward, and I felt the power of my defiance resonating within me. The figure of my father flickered, his expression changing from disappointment to something softer, sadness, perhaps. "You must forgive," he whispered, the words barely audible over the ticking of the clock. "Forgive?" I echoed, feeling the weight of his presence pressing against me. I've spent so long trying to prove myself. How can I forgive someone who never understood me? "Forgiveness is not for them, it is for you," he replied, his figure growing fainter. "Let go of the past, and you will find peace." The clock chimed again, and with a surge of energy, I reached out, willing to confront the shadows of my past. "I forgive you," I said, tears filling my eyes. "I forgive you for your expectations. I forgive you for the pain." As I spoke those words, the room exploded in light, the shadows dissolving around me. The clock began to tick forward, the hands moving in harmony with my heart. I felt a rush of relief as the burdens of my past lifted. But just as quickly, a new wave of darkness surged, and I felt myself being pulled once more. "Remember who you are," my grandfather's voice echoed in my mind, urging me forward. What awaited me next was still unknown, but I knew I had taken the first step toward breaking the clock's hold. I was ready to confront whatever time had in store for me. As the darkness enveloped me once more, I braced for whatever awaited me on the other side. When the world solidified again, I found myself in a familiar place, the old family kitchen, a room filled with warmth and the smell of freshly baked bread. But the air was thick with tension and unease that hung like a storm cloud. At the table sat my mother, her face drawn and weary, her hands clasped tightly around a mug. She looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes, but the moment quickly shifted to concern. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Why not?" I asked, feeling the weight of her gaze. "I need to understand. I have to face my past." Her expression softened, but sorrow shadowed her features. "Some moments are meant to be left behind. You don't understand the pain they hold." "I've faced my father," I replied, my voice firm. "I need to confront you too." There's so much left unsaid. She sighed, and the kitchen grew still. You were always the bright spot in my life, but I carried my own burdens. I didn't want you to see my struggles. I stepped closer, my heart racing. But I did see them. I felt the distance. I wanted to help you, but you pushed me away. Tears welled in her eyes, and she looked down at her hands. I was scared of letting you see my weaknesses. I thought if I stayed strong, you would have a better life. Being strong doesn't mean hiding, I urged, feeling the urgency of the moment. I wanted to be there for you, but you built walls instead. The clock on the wall began to tick louder, and with each chime, the kitchen shifted slightly, the colors fading into a muted palette. I could feel the tension in the air thickening, pressing down on us both. I'm sorry, my mother whispered, her voice trembling. I thought I was protecting you. But in doing so, you created a distance that hurt us both, I replied, my heart aching. It's time to break down those walls. It's time to forgive each other. As I spoke those words, I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. Forgiveness is not easy, she murmured, looking away. It means facing the pain. I know, I said, my voice steady. But it's necessary. We can't keep living in the shadows of our fears. The clock chimed again, a deep, resonating sound that filled the room. I stepped forward, my determination bolstering my resolve. I forgive you, Mom. For everything, the distance, the silence. I forgive you for not letting me in. As those words left my lips, the kitchen erupted in light. The shadows that had loomed over us began to dissolve, lifting the heaviness that had settled in the air. My mother's expression shifted, her face softening as if years of burden were finally being lifted. I forgive you too, she said, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her cheeks. I didn't mean to push you away. I just didn't know how to ask for help. In that moment, everything shifted. The walls of the kitchen glowed, the colors vibrant and alive, as if a long-lost warmth had returned. The clock began to tick forward, its hands moving steadily, a promise of time restored. But just as quickly, the light flickered, and I felt the familiar pull of darkness swirling around me. No! I shouted, but it was too late. The world dissolved, and I was once again thrust into the void. When I landed, I was in a different room entirely. This time, I stood in a dimly lit hallway filled with doors. Each door was marked with names and dates, echoes of moments that had shaped my life. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding. As I approached one door marked with my own name and the date of my 13th birthday, a surge of dread coursed through me. This was the day I had received the news of my grandfather's passing. I remembered the pain, the feeling of being lost without him. But I needed to confront it. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Inside, the room was filled with memories. My family gathered, tears mingling with laughter as we shared stories. Yet, in the center stood a younger version of myself, looking lost and frightened. I stepped inside, feeling the weight of the past pressing against me. You're not alone, I said, reaching out to my younger self. We're going to be okay. But the younger me looked up with wide eyes, fear etched on his face. What do you know? Everything is falling apart. I know it hurts, I replied, my voice steady. But you have to believe that you're stronger than this pain. You will find a way to carry their memory with you, not as a burden, but as a light. The clock began to chime again, and the room started to shake. Shadows danced along the walls, whispering doubts and fears. It's too much, the younger me cried. I can't handle it. Yes, you can. I shouted, feeling the weight of my own childhood fears wash over me. You are not defined by this moment. You will grow, you will heal. Trust me. As I spoke, the shadows began to retreat, the light growing stronger. The younger version of myself hesitated, then nodded slowly, a flicker of hope igniting in his eyes. I believe you, he whispered, and as he did, the room exploded in light. The pain and grief that had once held me captive began to dissolve. I felt a surge of energy coursing through me, the threads of my past weaving into a tapestry of strength and resilience. But just as I began to feel a sense of peace, the clock chimed again, pulling me into darkness once more. Remember who you are echoed in my mind as I felt the pull of time once again. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the study, the clock still ticking, but now I felt different. I had faced my fears, embraced my past, and forgiven those who had shaped my journey. Yet, I knew I was not finished. There were still shadows lurking, still moments to confront. The clock's power was not yet fully broken, and I had to find a way to free myself from its grasp completely. With renewed determination, I approached the clock once more. It pulsed with energy, and I realized I had the power to change the narrative. It was time to take control. Show me what I need to face, I demanded, gripping the pendulum tightly. The clock chimed one last time, and I felt the world begin to shift. I was ready to confront the final pieces of my past, whatever form they might take. I would not let fear dictate my future any longer. As the clock chimed, the world around me began to dissolve into a whirl of colors and shapes, swirling like a tempest. I felt a jolt of energy surge through me, and when the chaos finally settled, I found myself standing in a darkened room filled with the distant echoes of laughter and shouts. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the very walls were whispering secrets I was not meant to hear. I recognized this place. It was the school gymnasium, where I had experienced one of the most humiliating moments of my life. I could still remember the laughter of my classmates, the feeling of isolation as I stood alone, paralyzed by fear during the talent show. I stepped forward, my heart pounding. In the center of the gym stood a younger version of myself, trembling under the harsh lights. My classmates sat in rows, their faces a mixture of excitement and judgment. I could feel the shame wash over me, an old familiar sting. Not again, I whispered, my stomach twisting with anxiety. I had avoided this memory for so long, but now I had to confront it. Just breathe, I told the younger me, who looked up with wide, terrified eyes. You are not alone. As I moved closer, the laughter of my classmates faded, replaced by a heavy silence. The younger me was gripping a microphone, looking down at the stage as if it were a bottomless pit. I can't do this, he muttered, his voice shaking. Yes, you can, I urged, stepping into the spotlight. You're stronger than you think. You've practiced, and you have something to share with the world. The younger me shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. What if they laugh? What if I fail? Failure isn't the end, I replied, reaching out to him. It's part of the journey. Every time you fall, you get back up again. You can't let fear control you. As I spoke, the air around us began to shimmer, and the walls of the gymnasium grew fainter. I could feel the presence of my classmates, shadows of their former selves, flickering in and out of focus. They were waiting, but for what? Approval? Judgment? Look at them, I said, gesturing toward the audience. They are not your enemies. They are just as scared and uncertain as you are. We all are. The younger me took a deep breath, glancing at the faces in the audience. Slowly, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. "But what if I mess up?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then you will learn," I replied, my voice strong and steady. "It's okay to mess up. That's how we grow. Just be yourself. Trust in your voice." With a newfound determination, the younger me straightened his back and nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I can do this." The clock behind us chimed again, and the light intensified, wrapping around us like a warm embrace. I felt the fear that had once held me captive begin to melt away. The shadows that loomed over my past dissipated, replaced by a sense of clarity. "Now go," I urged him, taking a step back. "Show them who you are." He stepped forward, the microphone steady in his grip. The audience's faces shifted, now filled with curiosity rather than judgment. With each word he spoke, I felt a ripple of energy coursing through the room, the sound resonating with truth. As he sang, the walls of the gym glowed with light, illuminating memories of joy and laughter, a tapestry of moments that had once been overshadowed by fear. I watched as the younger me transformed, his confidence growing with every note, and for the first time, I felt the heaviness in my chest lift. The clock chimed once more, but this time it felt different. The rhythm was steady, a heartbeat echoing through time. The past no longer felt like a chain binding me. It was a part of my journey, a story I could now share. As the song reached its climax, the audience erupted into applause, their faces alight with admiration. The younger me looked out at them, a smile breaking through the uncertainty, a spark of joy igniting in his eyes. Then, as the final notes lingered in the air, the gymnasium began to fade, and I felt the familiar pull of darkness once again. "Remember who you are," echoed in my mind, the words a reminder of the strength I had found in facing my fears. As I was pulled into the void, I embraced the darkness, feeling the weight of my past lift as I transitioned into the unknown. I closed my eyes, allowing the echoes of the gym to wash over me, the applause ringing in my ears. When I opened my eyes once more, I found myself back in the study, the clock still ticking steadily on the wall. But now, it was different. The atmosphere felt lighter, and a sense of calm washed over me. I had faced my fears, embraced my past, and learned to forgive, not only others, but myself. I approached the clock, my heart steady. "I am ready to let you go," I said firmly. "No more running. No more hiding." The clock chimed once, a sound that resonated like a bell tolling for a new beginning. As I reached for the pendulum, I felt a surge of energy course through me, a final act of defiance against the shadows of my past. With one swift motion, I pulled the pendulum down. The clock shuddered violently, its hands spinning wildly. Light erupted from its center, flooding the room with warmth and clarity. The shadows that had haunted me began to dissolve, swept away by the brilliance of the light. I felt free, liberated from the chains of time that had bound me for so long. And then, just like that, it was over. The clock stopped, its hands resting peacefully at 12. The echoes of my past faded into a soft whisper, leaving behind a profound silence. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my journey settle within me. I had survived the storm, faced the darkness, and emerged stronger than I ever imagined. As I stepped away from the clock, I knew that my past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined who I was. I had broken free, ready to embrace the future and all the moments yet to come. With a renewed sense of purpose, I opened the door to the study and stepped out into the world, ready to create my own story, one moment at a time. Have you ever felt watched, even when you were alone? It's a strange feeling, isn't it? You can be in your own space, with no one around, yet the sense that something, or someone, is observing you can be suffocating. And what if I told you that feeling wasn't just in your head? What if it was real? I've lived in my apartment for nearly 3 years. It's nothing special, just a simple one-bedroom place with enough space for me to feel comfortable. But lately, things have felt off. It started with little things, objects out of place, shadows that lingered longer than they should have, but I chalked it up to stress or maybe just the dull effects of too much time spent in the same space. That was, until the mirror. It wasn't a particularly special mirror. I bought it from a small furniture store downtown because my old one had cracked. The new one was simple, a full-length, framed in dark wood. It was the kind of mirror you'd expect to see in any home. Nothing ominous about it, right? But from the moment I hung it on the wall in the corner of my bedroom, something felt strange. The air in the room seemed to shift. The space around it felt heavier, like the mirror wasn't just reflecting the room, it was absorbing it. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. I would glance at it as I passed by, or when I got dressed in the morning. The reflection was always just a little too clear, too perfect. Everything in the room was visible, but there was something about the stillness of the reflection that unsettled me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. One night, I woke up to the sound of faint breathing. It wasn't mine. It wasn't the hum of the refrigerator or the soft whisper of wind outside the window. It was close, right next to me. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, but I could make out the shape of the mirror on the wall across from my bed. The soft moonlight that filtered through the curtains illuminated the edges of the frame, casting a long shadow across the floor. That's why I saw them. In the reflection, there were eyes. Dark eyes, staring at me from the depths of the mirror. At first, I thought it was my imagination, maybe the effect of the low light playing tricks on me. But no! The eyes didn't belong to me. They were too dark, too intense. And they were fixed on me, unblinking, as if they were waiting for something. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, thinking I was still half asleep. But when I looked back at the mirror, the eyes were still there, closer now, clearer. They were dark, like endless pits, and they were watching me, waiting for me to move. I wanted to scream, to call out, but the words caught in my throat. I could hear the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, but the eyes, they didn't move. They just stayed there, waiting. A part of me wanted to turn away, to forget about it and go back to sleep, but I couldn't. The longer I stared, the more I felt like I was being pulled into the mirror. Like I was falling deeper into those eyes, as if they were dragging me in. My hand reached out, almost of its own accord, toward the mirror. I told myself to stop, but my fingers brushed against the cool glass anyway. The moment I touched it, a sharp, cold shock ran through my body. It wasn't just the temperature of the glass. It was as though the mirror was alive, as if it had just woken up. My heart hammered in my chest, my skin tingling, and the room seemed to bend around me. The reflection in the mirror shimmered for a split second, as though the fabric of reality itself was warping. Then, the eyes blinked. I jerked back, pulling my hand away from the mirror as if it had burned me. The eyes were still there, but now there was something else. A figure. It wasn't clear at first, but as I looked closer, I saw it, someone standing behind the eyes, their forms shifting in and out of focus. They were tall, their features indistinct, but the sense of presence was overwhelming. And then I heard it, the softest of whispers, coming from the mirror. "Come closer." I didn't know how to react. My feet were frozen in place, my body unwilling to obey my mind's frantic commands to move. The figure in the mirror seemed to reach toward me, its hands stretching out, its fingers long and thin, each one curling with a beckoning motion. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was an invitation. I backed away, stumbling toward the door of my room, but I couldn't stop looking at the mirror. I wanted to close my eyes, to block it out, but the eyes kept following me. They weren't just in a reflection, they were in my mind, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. The mirror was still there, in the corner of my room, watching me. But I didn't dare approach it again. I didn't even want to look at it. Days passed, but the eyes never left me. I could feel them even while I wasn't in the room. In the back of my mind, I knew they were waiting for me to come closer. The mirror was no longer just a mirror. It had become something else. Something hungry. And it was waiting. Always waiting. It had been 3 days since that night. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself that I had imagined it all, sleep deprivation, stress, maybe even a bad dream that lingered a little too long. But the eyes, those eyes, they were burned into my mind. I couldn't stop seeing them, no matter how hard I tried. The mirror was still in the same spot. I had avoided it as much as possible, choosing to ignore its presence entirely. But no matter how much I tried to distance myself from it, the eyes seemed to follow me everywhere I went. In the corner of my vision, in the reflections of windows, even in the darkened puddles of rainwater on the street outside. I had begun to feel paranoid, on edge, like I was being watched constantly. The idea that the mirror had somehow embedded itself into my mind wasn't a comforting thought, but it was the only explanation that made sense. My mind was playing tricks on me, right? But that wasn't the worst part. I couldn't stop thinking about the whispers. They were faint, almost imperceptible at first, but every day they grew louder, more distinct. They were always there, even while I was alone. "Come closer," they would say, sometimes as a soft murmur, sometimes as a sharp, insistent command. Sometimes it felt like they came from inside my own head, and other times it was as if they came from the mirror itself. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was waiting for me, somewhere beyond the glass. Something that wanted me to step into it. But the thought of getting anywhere near that mirror was terrifying. What if those eyes were real? What if they were waiting for me to make the mistake of getting too close? It was late in the afternoon when it happened again. I had just come back from work, my nerves already frayed from the constant pressure of feeling like I was being watched. I walked through the door of my apartment, my eyes immediately flicking to the corner where the mirror hung. It was like I was compelled to look, even though I didn't want to. There was something different about it today. The air around the mirror felt charged, electric, like static clinging to every inch of the room. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel my breath catch in my throat as I watched the reflection shift. At first, it was subtle. Just a slight distortion of the edges, like a ripple in water. But then it grew. The edges of the mirror seemed to darken, the reflection warping in a way that made the room around me feel foreign, like it was being swallowed up by the glass. And then, I saw them again. The eyes. They were no longer distant, just staring from the depths of the glass. Now, they were closer. Clearer. almost as if they were right behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty, just like it had been a moment ago. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a cold chill spreading down my spine. I had to get away. I had to leave. But then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible shuffle from behind the mirror. Like someone moving in the shadows, just beyond my reach. My heart skipped a beat. I took a step back, my hand instinctively reaching for the door to escape. But before I could move, the whisper came again, louder this time, more urgent. Come closer. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. The tone in that voice had changed. It wasn't just beckoning anymore, it was demanding, as if the thing behind the mirror had grown impatient. I knew I shouldn't. I knew that stepping any closer would be a mistake. But my body didn't listen to my mind. It was like my legs were moving on their own, drawn to the mirror by some unseen force. I didn't even realize I was walking toward it until my fingers were hovering just inches from the glass. The air was freezing now, thick with a cold that seeped into my bones. The dark eyes in the reflection seemed to widen, the shadows around them deepening as if they were alive. The figure behind them, was it closer? I couldn't tell, but it felt like it was reaching for me. Reaching through the glass, through time, through space. I recoiled, stepping back quickly, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My hand shook, and I tried to pull away, but something in my mind was telling me to stay. To go further. No. I couldn't. I had to resist. I turned, running out of the room and down the hallway, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my thoughts racing. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The air in the hallway felt suffocating, like it was closing in around me, pushing me toward the mirror. But I couldn't go back. Not now. Not after what I had just felt. That night, I lay in bed, trying to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still see those eyes staring at me. Waiting for me. I could hear the whisper in the dark, taunting me, drawing me back to the room. I couldn't escape it. No matter where I went, the eyes were there. Watching. Waiting. And now, I knew that whatever was behind the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was real. It was something alive, something that had been waiting for me to get too close. And sooner or later, I would have to face it. The question was, would I survive it? I couldn't escape it. The mirror, the eyes, the whispers, they had burrowed into my mind like parasites. Even while I was out of the apartment, trying to distract myself with work or errands, they followed me, just beneath the surface of my thoughts. At night, when the apartment was silent and dark, I could almost hear the faint murmur of the whispers, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark eyes staring back at me, just beyond the glass. The fear was suffocating. It wasn't just the mirror anymore. It was everything. The air felt heavier in my own apartment. The walls felt closer, like they were closing in on me with every passing minute. The quiet shuffling sounds continued, but now they weren't limited to just the mirror. I could hear them all around the apartment, following me as I moved from room to room. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint shift of air felt like something, or someone, was watching, waiting for me to slip up. I couldn't take it any longer. I had to know what was behind that mirror. I had to confront whatever it was that had begun to haunt me. But a part of me, the part that still clung to logic and reason, told me that doing so was the worst thing I could do. The other part of me, the part that had already crossed the line from rational thought into something darker, something desperate, told me I had no choice. I stood in front of the mirror again, my hand shaking as I reached for it. This time, I didn't hesitate. The glass was cold to the touch, and for a moment, I stood there, my fingertips pressing gently against its surface. The room felt unnervingly still, but I could sense the energy, the pull, drawing me closer to the mirror. A breath caught in my throat as I pressed harder, expecting to feel the smooth surface give way. But instead, the mirror shifted. The edges warped, distorting as though the glass was somehow bending like the surface of water. The eyes, those dark, terrifying eyes, were staring at me again. But now, they were different. They weren't just looking at me, they were moving, shifting, like they were following my every twitch, my every movement. The shadows around them began to grow, spreading from the corners of the glass and reaching out toward me, wrapping around the frame like dark tendrils. A strange chill filled the room, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. My breath fogged in front of me, the cold seeping into my skin, into my very bones. It was as if the air itself had become alive, as though the mirror was no longer just a reflection, but a gateway. "Come closer," the whisper came again, this time louder, more demanding. It echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls of my mind, drowning out all other thoughts. I was paralyzed. Part of me wanted to run, to break free from this grip on my psyche, but another part of me, curiosity, maybe, or a sense of inevitable doom, forced me to step forward. My body moved against my will, each step feeling like it took an eternity, until I was standing directly in front of the mirror. And then, without warning, the eyes blinked. They blinked. I stumbled back, heart racing, but my feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. The eyes weren't just watching me anymore. They were aware of me. Alive. A low, guttural sound emanated from the depths of the glass. The shadows behind the eyes were shifting now, moving like something alive, stretching toward me. The whispers turned into low, unintelligible murmurs, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, urging me to come closer, to step into the mirror. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, unable to look away. And then, something worse happened. The reflection of my own face in the mirror began to change. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, but then more clearly. My features started to distort, my eyes growing darker, deeper. I could feel my face shifting, my expression twisting into something I didn't recognize. In the reflection, I smiled. But I didn't smile. My body, my mouth, was smiling for me, stretching into a grin that wasn't mine. The reflection's smile grew wider, grotesque, and the eyes, those eyes, began to narrow in amusement. I wanted to scream, to break the mirror, to run, but I couldn't. It was as if my body was no longer my own, as if I was trapped in a reflection of myself that was slowly taking over. The reflection in the mirror moved independently now. It lifted its hand, slowly reaching out toward the glass, its fingers pressing against the surface where mine had been moments ago. The touch was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt, like ice forming beneath my skin. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw the reflection of something behind me. A figure, dark and shapeless, standing just beyond the edge of the mirror's frame. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone, but the eyes, those eyes, were still watching me. The reflection in the mirror smiled again, the grin growing wider, stretching impossibly far. And as it did, I could hear it, no longer a whisper, but a voice, clear and unmistakable. "You're mine now." I didn't understand what it meant. I didn't know what would happen next. But as I backed away from the mirror, I could feel it, the presence, lingering in the air. It was there, and it wasn't going away. The question burned in my mind, how could I escape something that was already inside me? I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The reflection, those dark eyes, kept pulling me back. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. It was as if they were inside my head, watching me from the inside out. The whispering had stopped for a moment, but it was only temporary, like the silence before a storm. It felt like there was no escape. I tried to tell myself it was just the mirror. Just a trick of my mind, my fear taking shape. But deep down, I knew better. I had been pulled into something much darker, something much more dangerous than I had ever anticipated. I tried to ignore it, to go about my day as usual. But the weight of the mirror's gaze never left me. I went to work, did the usual errands, but the world felt different. The corners of my vision were darker. The sounds around me became sharper, more intense, like everything was turning on me. It wasn't just the mirror anymore, it was everything. The air was thicker, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me slowly. I thought I saw things. Figures, shadows, out of the corner of my eye, in places where there should have been nothing. I would turn my head quickly, only to find nothing there. But the feeling, the presence, remained. I felt like I was being followed, but no one was there. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront it, whatever it was. I had to figure out what was happening to me before I lost myself completely. I returned to the apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. The mirror was there, still in place, reflecting everything around it. But this time, I was ready. I had made up my mind. I had to destroy it, break it, do anything to stop the madness that had overtaken me. But as I stood before it, something was different. The reflection in the glass was moving. Not just my own, but the room itself. The walls stretched and distorted as though they were warping in sync with the reflection. And the eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, stared back at me. They blinked. Slowly, deliberately, as though they were savoring the moment. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a mirror. It was something else. Something ancient. Something alive. I stepped closer, my breath shallow. The floor creaked under my feet. And then the whispers started again, but they weren't just whispers. They were words. Words I could understand now. Come closer. The voice was like ice, slicing through the air, cold and unyielding. The reflection's grin widened, and I could see it, something moving in the depths of the glass, something slithering just out of sight. It was as if the mirror had become a doorway, a portal to a place I couldn't comprehend. Don't fight it, the voice whispered again, this time more insistent, more commanding. You can't escape me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, my feet glued to the floor. The reflection, my reflection, stepped out of the mirror. Slowly, impossibly, it emerged from the glass, its hand reaching toward me. I could feel the cold radiating from it, a bone-chilling frost that seeped into my skin. I could hear the sound of my own heart thudding in my chest, faster and faster, as the reflection moved closer. You're mine, it whispered, and the voice was no longer just in my head. It was everywhere, around me, inside me. It was me. My reflection was me. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter, the air thicker, as if the mirror had begun to consume everything in its path. I tried to move, tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The reflection, I took another step toward me, its face stretching into a grotesque, impossible grin. I didn't know what was happening. All I knew was that I couldn't let me get any closer. I shoved forward, breaking free from the paralysis. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and collided with the wall. The mirror shimmered in front of me, and for a moment I thought it was going to swallow me whole. But then, nothing. The room was still. The reflection was gone. I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the mirror. I was alone. But I knew I wasn't. I could feel it, the presence still lingering, hovering in the air. The mirror didn't just reflect a room. It reflected me, but it was more than that. It was a doorway to something far darker, something that would never let me go. I was no longer sure where the reflection ended and I began. I had tried to escape, but I hadn't. I had only begun to realize that I had already been pulled into its grip. And now, no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I tried to move, it would follow me. The eyes would always be watching. The days that followed were a blur of unease. My apartment felt different, the air too heavy to breathe, the walls too close. I could still hear the whispering sometimes, faint but insistent, and the weight of those dark eyes followed me everywhere I went. It was no longer just a reflection, it had become a presence, something watching, waiting. I couldn't escape it. I tried everything. I covered the mirror with a blanket, but even then, I could still feel its gaze. I moved the mirror from one limb to another, hoping the change in location would help, but the whispers followed, the coldness lingered. It was as though the mirror wasn't just a thing, but a curse, an extension of something much more ancient, something far more powerful than I had ever imagined. One night, when I was at my lowest, I decided to try one last thing. I had to face it, truly face it, and make it stop. I stood before the mirror again, but this time I didn't try to avoid the reflection. I didn't shy away from the eyes staring back at me. I had been running for too long. Now, I had no choice but to confront it. The room was silent except for the sound of my own breath. My heart raced, and I felt the cold emanating from the glass, but this time I didn't flinch. The darkness in the mirror seemed to pulse, as though it was alive, a living thing, and the eyes, those terrible, hollow eyes, stared deep into mine. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered to it, my voice shaking. The reflection didn't respond, but I could feel it. It knew. It knew what I was asking. The grin spread across my face in the mirror, not mine, but its, a twisted parody of my own. It was laughing, silently, mocking me. I took a step forward. Then another. My breath hitched as I reached out, touching the cold surface of the glass. A jolt of ice shot through my fingertips, and I gasped, pulling my hand back, but the sensation lingered in my bones. Then it happened. The reflection began to shift. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But no! The mirror didn't just reflect the room, it was changing. The reflection of my apartment, my living room, twisted and warped. The walls stretched out like rubber, the furniture floating, shifting shapes. The air grew thick, like the space itself was collapsing inward. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. It was in the mirror with me now. The figure that had been lurking behind my reflection, the dark silhouette with the hollow eyes, was stepping toward me, emerging from the glass. It was taller than me, its limbs unnaturally long, its movements jerky and fluid all at once. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I was rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. Its eyes, were locking onto mine, and I could feel the weight of it, like it was drawing something from me, feeding off my fear. The creature reached out, its hand long and spindly, its fingers impossibly thin, and I could hear the faintest sound, a click, like bones scraping against glass. I tried to back away, but the mirror wouldn't let me. I was drawn in. It was pulling me in. The creature was inside the glass, inside my mind. I gasped and tried to pull back, but there was no escaping. I felt something cold wrap around my wrist, and before I could react, the world shifted violently. The mirror wasn't there anymore. I was no longer in my apartment. I was in the dark. I couldn't see anything, couldn't breathe. The darkness was suffocating, consuming me. And then I heard it. The whispers. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, millions of voices, speaking all at once, and I couldn't understand them, but they all had one thing in common, a promise. You are ours. The coldness deepened, and I could feel it, the creature, the thing that had been in the mirror, its presence was everywhere. It was inside me now, part of me, and I couldn't escape it. The darkness was closing in, tightening around me like a vice. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I woke up. But it wasn't over. I opened my eyes to find myself still standing in my apartment. The mirror was there, but it wasn't the same. It was cracked, shattered, its surface reflecting the room in fragments. But even though it was broken, I could see the eyes. The dark, hollow eyes, staring at me from within the pieces of the glass. They were still watching me. Always. Watching. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, the mirror would always be there. The reflection, the creature, the eyes, it would always be there, waiting. I had become a part of it, and there was no escaping the darkness that I had invited into my life. There was no escape from the mirror. Have you ever returned home only to find something utterly out of place, something that shouldn't be there, but was? It happened to me the day I came back from my trip. I walked into my house, tired from the long journey, only to notice something strange, a glass panel embedded in the wall of my living room where no such thing had been before. It was completely clear, almost invisible, blending into the surrounding woodwork, but it was there. It felt wrong. It shouldn't have been there. At first, I thought it might have been some kind of odd decoration or a mistake made by the contractors who had worked on the house before I moved in. But as I examined it closer, I realized it wasn't just the glass that was strange, it was the space on the other side. It wasn't my living room anymore. On the other side of the glass, I could see something. It wasn't a reflection, I knew that. The room through the glass looked different, distorted, as if viewed through water. The furniture was wrong, the colors were off, and there was an unnatural stillness in the air. It was as though I was looking into a warped version of my own home, a place that shouldn't exist. The furniture sat in odd positions, and the shadows cast by the lamp stretched too long, too far. The whole scene was unnerving, like a dream that was just one step away from nightmare. I stepped closer to the glass, trying to convince myself that I was just tired, that I was imagining things. But the longer I stared, the more it felt like something was watching me from the other side. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a presence, something unseen but aware of my every move. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed my hand against the glass, half expecting it to be cold, but it was warm, too warm, like the room on the other side was radiating heat. I pulled my hand back quickly, startled by the sensation, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just an optical illusion, but the pull of the glass panel was undeniable. There was something on the other side, something that didn't belong, and it was calling me. The days that followed were filled with strange occurrences. The glass panel never changed, but I could feel the distortion in the air growing stronger. The shadows in my house seemed to move differently, like they were no longer bound by the walls of the room. Sometimes I could hear a faint whispering, like voices coming from the other side of the glass. It was so faint, I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading, desperate. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was on the other side of that glass. I gathered my courage, convinced myself I was just being paranoid, and stepped closer to the panel. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. And when I touched the glass again, something shifted. The world around me seemed to tilt, like I was falling, but I wasn't moving. The glass pane rippled, like water, and before I knew it, I found myself on the other side. The room was exactly as I had seen it through the glass, only now I was inside it. The furniture was even more out of place up close, as though it had been rearranged in a way that defied logic. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, and I realized it was coming from the furniture itself. Each piece seemed to hum with a voice, and the shadows on the walls were no longer just shadows. They moved, shifted, and twisted in shapes that were too unnatural to comprehend. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, looking for a way out. The door that I knew should be there wasn't. There was no exit. The glass panel, my glass panel, was nowhere to be found. It was as though the room had swallowed it whole. I was trapped. I stumbled through the distorted space, my steps quickening as the oppressive atmosphere closed in around me. The furniture started to shift, the chairs creaking as though they were alive. The shadows that had once been harmless now had shapes, faces. They grinned at me from the corners, their eyes empty but full of malice. The whispers were now voices, clear and distinct. "Stay," they said. "You can never leave." I couldn't understand how this could be real. How could this room exist? How could it have been hidden behind my wall? Nothing made sense. The world outside, the one I had known, felt so far away now, like it belonged to someone else. I turned in circles, desperate, trying to find an escape, but it was no use. The longer I stayed in this warped version of my home, the more I could feel myself losing grip on reality. The glass panel had taken me, pulled me into a place where nothing made sense, where time and space no longer followed the rules. I wasn't just in a room anymore. I was inside a nightmare. But then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the glass panel reappeared. Not on the wall, but in front of me. I saw the distorted reflection of my own face staring back at me, but the eyes weren't mine. They were empty, hollow, lost. The whispers grew louder. And then, with a jolt, I was back in my living room, standing in front of the glass panel. It was exactly as it had been when I first discovered it. But something was different. I wasn't alone anymore. The eyes that stared back at me, those eyes, weren't just reflections. They were mine. And they weren't looking at me. They were looking past me, towards something else, something behind me. The glass wall wasn't just a window to another room. It was a barrier, one that would never let me leave. The days after that moment felt like a blur, each one blending into the next. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen on the other side of the glass. The whispers, the distorted furniture, the eyes that weren't mine, they haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been waiting for me on the other side was still out there, lurking just behind the glass. At first, I tried to tell myself it was all just a bad dream. Maybe I had been more tired than I realized, or maybe it was some trick of the mind. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, there was a nagging doubt that wouldn't go away. Every time I looked at the glass panel, I felt it again, the pull, the presence on the other side, watching, waiting. The glass wasn't just a window, it was something else, something that defied explanation. I couldn't avoid it forever. Sooner or later, I knew I would have to face whatever it was that had reached through the glass to take me. But even as I tried to prepare myself, I couldn't help but feel more and more drawn to it. The whispers became more frequent, more insistent, and I realized with a chill that they weren't just voices. They were thoughts. My thoughts. The glass was making me hear them. The line between my own mind and whatever was on the other side was growing thinner. It was late one evening, after dinner, when I finally decided to confront the glass again. My heart raced as I stepped into the living room. The panel seemed to pulse in the dim light of the room, its presence so overwhelming I could almost feel it in the air. It was as though the glass had become an extension of myself, something I couldn't escape, no matter how far I ran. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand what was behind that glass. Slowly, I approached it. My fingers trembled as I reached out, hesitating just before touching it. My reflection stared back at me, my own face, but the eyes. Those eyes. They were still hollow, still watching me, but now they seemed more aware. It was as though they knew what I was thinking, knew I was afraid. And they waited. They always waited. Without thinking, I touched the glass. The instant my fingers made contact, a shiver ran down my spine. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to shift around me. The walls pressed in, the shadows deepened, and the faint whispers began again, but louder this time. Come closer. I recoiled, heart pounding. The voice wasn't just in my head anymore, it was coming from behind the glass. It wasn't the soft, indistinct murmurs I had heard before. No, this voice was clear, demanding. It wasn't asking, it was telling me. You can't leave, it said, its tone chillingly calm. My breath caught in my throat. It was as though the room itself had become alive, pulsing with energy. The glass didn't just separate two spaces, it connected them, linking my world to the one beyond. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps on the other side. Slow, deliberate. Coming closer. I looked around, but there was no one in the room with me. The air felt thicker, heavier. Every breath I took felt like it was suffocating me. The whispers had become voices now, clear and distinct. You shouldn't have touched it. I spun around, my heart racing. The room was empty, nothing had changed, but the voices were real. I could feel them pressing in from all sides. And then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door. The door to the living room, the one I had always used to enter and exit, was now shut. It hadn't been shut before. I knew it hadn't. I would have noticed. Panic began to rise in me. The door didn't just feel closed, it felt locked, as though I was trapped in here, with no way out. My mind raced. There had to be a way to escape. There had to be a way to make it stop. I turned back toward the glass, but something was different. The image through the panel was no longer the distorted room I had seen before. It was worse. The colors had shifted, the shadows had deepened, and the once familiar furniture had become twisted, alive in a way that I couldn't comprehend. The chairs weren't just chairs anymore. They were hunched figures, sitting still but somehow moving, their eyes following me, their bodies contorting unnaturally. And the whispers, they were no longer whispers. They were screams. The voices were rising now, filling the space. They were pleading, crying, begging. But for what? I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. My legs felt weak, as though they might give out beneath me. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. There was only the glass. The shadows through the glass began to shift again, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing just behind the distorted reflection of my own face. A figure that was not mine. It stood perfectly still, its features obscured by the ripples in the glass, but its eyes were locked on mine. They were dark, hollow, filled with an emptiness that seemed to stretch forever. And I knew, without a doubt, that the figure had been waiting for me. "You're not supposed to be here," it whispered. Its voice wasn't human. It was cold, distant, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "You never should have come." I froze. The room around me was no longer mine. It had become something else, something dark, something twisted. And the more I stared into the glass, the more it seemed to reach toward me, pulling me in, drawing me closer to the other side. I was running out of time. Something was going to happen, and I didn't know if I would survive it. The glass was waiting. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the very walls of the house were closing in around me. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain the figure behind the glass could hear it. The world outside the panel seemed to warp with every passing second, and I felt the unshakable sensation that I was no longer just in the room with the glass. I was somewhere else entirely. A place that wasn't mine. The figure, no, it stood perfectly still, its eyes never leaving mine. Those eyes were dark, impossibly dark, like black holes that threatened to swallow everything in their path. I tried to move, to look away, but my body betrayed me. My feet felt cemented to the floor. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows on the other side shifted again. The figure, now clearer but still just a silhouette, seemed to draw closer. My stomach lurched. There was something wrong about it. The way it moved, or rather didn't move, it seemed to float, as if gravity didn't apply to it. I blinked, and the room behind the glass twisted once more, the walls bending like rubber, the furniture morphing into grotesque shapes. The living shadows weren't just reflections anymore, they were entities, sentient and watching. They were moving toward the glass, their presence growing more oppressive by the second. I stumbled back, bumping into the coffee table. The sharp, resonating sound seemed to pierce the silence, but it wasn't the noise that made me freeze. It was the shift in the room. The atmosphere had changed. The normal hum of the house, the soft, familiar creaks of the floorboards, the distant sounds of the neighborhood had fallen away. It was as though the house itself had become isolated from the world outside, suspended in some unreachable place. I was alone. And I was not alone. The figure behind the glass tilted its head, as if it were studying me. It was then I noticed something else. Its eyes, those endless pits, were beginning to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, until they seemed to burn with an otherworldly light. It wasn't the kind of light that illuminated the room. No, this light consumed it, bleeding into every corner of the space. The walls, once solid and sturdy, began to dissolve into darkness. A ripple of energy passed through the air, vibrating in my bones. "You can't leave," the figure whispered again, the words like ice sinking into my skin. Its voice was no longer distant. It was right here, inside my head. "This is your home now." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind reeled, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming, hallucinating. But as I reached out to touch the glass again, the sudden cold of it seared through my skin, jolting me into terrifying clarity. This was not a dream. This was happening. I backed away from the glass, my feet stumbling over the rug. I reached for the door. The one that had been locked. My hand trembled as I gripped the handle. It should have opened. But it didn't. The door remained immovable, as though it had fused with the walls. "Why won't you leave?" The voice from behind the glass echoed louder now. "Don't you understand? You're part of this now." Terror ripped through me, my mind screaming to escape, to fight, to do anything to make it stop. I looked around frantically for anything that could help, but nothing made sense. The room had distorted, the space had become wrong. The shadows stretched across the floor, undulating like a living thing. The windows were gone, replaced by more of the glass panels. They were everywhere now, encasing me, trapping me in a world that wasn't mine, with no escape. In a desperate frenzy, I turned back to the glass. The figure was closer now, its form becoming more defined, its features shifting, taking shape in the distorted reflection of my own face. It smiled, or at least I think it did. Its mouth, if it could be called that, was stretched in a grotesque grin, too wide for any human being. "You belong here with us." The words were no longer just whispers. They were an overwhelming chorus of voices, all coming from the same source. "This is where you will stay. Forever." The glass seemed to pulse with energy, the reflections inside it growing stronger, clearer. A feeling of despair washed over me. The figure was no longer just observing me, it was becoming me. I could feel it, feel its presence in my own thoughts, slipping into my mind. It was a parasite, an invasive force that consumed everything in its path. And now, it was taking over my very soul. I stumbled back, my hand desperately searching for anything to hold on to. And then I heard it. A faint sound. Almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder. A knocking, no, not knocking. It was scratching. Scratching at the walls, at the floor, at the door. A desperate sound, as though something, or someone, was trying to break in. I turned to the source of the noise, but there was nothing there. The door was still shut, the room still empty, save for the suffocating presence behind the glass. The scratching continued, relentless, growing louder and more frantic. "They are coming." The voice from the glass was almost giddy, as though it was excited for what was about to happen. "It's too late for you. You'll be ours, just like the others." I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight, but there was nothing to fight. The air was thick with the energy of the glass, the oppressive weight of it pressing in on me, suffocating me. I could feel the walls closing in, the space around me warping further. And then, just as the last shred of hope slipped away, the scratching at the door grew even more frantic. And in that moment, I realized the terrible truth. It wasn't just the figure behind the glass that was waiting for me. It was the others, the ones that had already been trapped here, that had already become part of this twisted reality. And they were coming. And they were waiting to pull me in. The sound of scratching intensified, now a relentless clawing, each scrape against the door sending a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just an ordinary sound, it was the kind of noise that gnawed at your very nerves, burrowing deep into your mind. I could feel the walls trembling with the force of it. Something was out there. Something was trying to get in. I pressed myself against the farthest corner of the room, my eyes never leaving the glass, my body trembling with terror. The figure within the reflection, it wasn't just standing anymore. It was moving, its form now shifting unnaturally, bending in ways that should have been impossible. The glass seemed to ripple with each movement, as though the reflection wasn't just an image but something far more dangerous, something alive. My mind raced. I needed to escape. I needed to do something. Anything. But where was I supposed to go? The door was locked. The windows were covered with more of those glass panels, each one holding an eerie reflection of the room, each one showing a world that was slipping further away from the one I knew. The scratching at the door grew louder, the sound now accompanied by a low growl, deep and guttural, like the rumbling of a distant storm. And then, the figure in the glass, it spoke again. "You can't leave," it said, its voice now no longer just a whisper. It was an unearthly chorus, many voices layered on top of one another, growing more menacing by the second. "The glass is a part of you now, and you are a part of it." My throat tightened, fear clawing at my chest. The air in the room was growing colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath, visible in the dim light. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched long and twisted, reaching toward me like fingers grasping for my very soul. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight, to get away from this nightmare. But there was nowhere to go. The walls of the room had become suffocating, closing in with each passing second. I could feel the glass pressing against my mind, its invisible force pushing me closer to the edge, closer to whatever it was waiting for me on the other side. The scratching at the door stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard something far worse. A soft click, as if the door had unlocked by itself. The sound echoed through the room, sending waves of dread through my body. I turned toward the door, my pulse quickening. The handle was now moving, twisting on its own, as though it were being manipulated by something unseen. I took a step forward, instinctively reaching for the handle, though every part of me screamed to turn away. But I couldn't. My body was moving on its own, driven by some primal urge I couldn't control. The door creaked open just a fraction, and I could see something beyond it. Something in the shadows. The scratching had stopped, but the low growl had returned, closer now, reverberating through the walls and rattling my bones. It was as though the house itself was alive, the walls closing in, the air thick with a terrible pressure. I pushed the door open a little more, stepping cautiously into the hallway. The darkness beyond the door was absolute. There was no light, no warmth. Just an overwhelming sense of wrongness, like the very essence of the house had shifted into something malevolent. The shadows in the hallway stretched out in unnatural ways, twisting like living things, their forms reaching toward me. And as I looked, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. There were other doors, more panels of glass. They were all around me now, in the hallway, each one reflecting something different. Some showed the room I had just left, others revealed distorted images of rooms that didn't belong to this house, places I had never seen. And through each one, I could feel them. Watching. Waiting. The figures on the other side of the glass weren't just reflections anymore. They were something more. They were alive, and they were hungry. I took a step back, the terror washing over me like a cold wave. The glass in the hallway seemed to pulse with an eerie glow, each reflection now showing faces, distorted, twisted faces, pressing against the glass, their mouths moving, though I couldn't hear them. But I could feel their intent. They were trying to break through, trying to reach me. I turned, my legs weak beneath me, desperate to get away. But the hallway was no longer the hallway. The walls had shifted, the space had stretched, and what I had thought was a door was now just another reflection, another glass panel showing me a version of the hallway I had just left. The real door, the way out, was nowhere to be seen. My pulse raced, my mind screamed for escape, but my body had become paralyzed with fear. The reflection of me in the glass panels, no longer just a reflection, was smiling. It was smiling back at me. "You can't hide from us." The voice echoed, 100 voices, 1,000, all speaking in unison. "This is where you belong. Forever." I fell to my knees, my hands shaking uncontrollably. There was no escape. There was no way out. The glass had taken me, and it was never going to let go. And then, in the deepest corner of the hallway, a figure stepped forward, its body a dark silhouette against the dim light. It was more than a shadow. It was something that had been waiting for me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The figure took another step closer. Its eyes, those terrible, empty eyes, locked onto mine. It reached out, and in that moment, I knew. The glass wasn't just a barrier. It was a trap. And I was already caught. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure was closing in, its shape more tangible with each step, as though the air itself was bending to its will. I could feel the pressure building, the oppressive weight of it all pressing in on me from every direction. The glass, those endless panes of transparent horror, shifted around me, warping the space in ways that defied any logic. I was trapped. The figure in the hallway, whatever it was not human. It had no face, no features beyond the darkness that seemed to consume its form. But I could feel it. I could feel its eyes, though I could not see them. They were on me, heavy, malevolent. It was as if it had been watching me for a long time, waiting for me to notice it, waiting for me to cross the threshold. It reached out with long, spindly fingers, fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly far, each movement deliberate and slow. I backed away, my legs shaky, my body screaming to run, but the hallway had become an endless maze. The walls had shifted, creating an inescapable labyrinth of glass, and with every turn I made, I was only met with more reflections, more doors, more walls, more faces in the glass. "No," I whispered to myself, unable to comprehend the nightmare unfolding around me. The reflection in the glass didn't mirror my own fear, it mirrored something far worse. My reflection smiled back at me, its eyes empty and hollow, a grin stretched too wide, too unnaturally. "You belong here," the figure whispered in a voice that was both inside my head and all around me. "This place is your home now. Forever." My heart thundered in my chest, the sound of it deafening in the silence that had fallen over the room. I couldn't breathe. The air had become thick, suffocating. The figure in the hallway continued to approach, its presence consuming all the light, pulling the very warmth from the room. I turned and ran, no plan, no direction, just the desperate need to escape. My footsteps echoed through the maze of glass, each step growing more frantic. The walls around me seemed to bend, distorting their reflections into grotesque shapes that twisted and shifted as I passed. Each reflection showed a different version of me, a version I didn't recognize. Some were smiling, others were crying, some were staring blankly, and some were reaching. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't afford to. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to keep moving, but it was as if the very space was fighting against me, pulling me back, trapping me. And then, I reached a dead end. I slammed into the glass wall in front of me, my palms pressing against the cool surface, desperate for a way through. But there was nothing, no exit, no escape. Only more glass. More reflections. More faces. Please. I whispered, my voice breaking. Please, let me go. But the figure was close now, so close I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. I could hear its slow, steady breathing, each exhale sending chills down my spine. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know why it was doing this to me. But I knew one thing for certain, it wasn't going to let me leave. You can't run, it said, its voice now a chilling whisper that seemed to come from every direction. You are part of this place now. There is no leaving. I slammed my fist against the glass, the sound of impact sharp in the stillness. But it didn't break. The glass didn't even crack. It was unyielding, impenetrable. The walls had become a prison, and the reflections were the bars that kept me locked inside. The figure was right behind me now, so close I could feel its cold presence, could sense the darkness radiating from it. Its breath was no longer a whisper, but a deep, rasping growl that filled the air, vibrating through my bones. And then, I heard it. A faint crack. I turned just in time to see a hairline fracture appear on the glass wall in front of me. The crack spread quickly, a jagged line splitting the surface. But it wasn't just the glass that was breaking, it was the very reality around me. The world seemed to fracture with it, the air warping and distorting, the space between the walls stretching in impossible ways. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to act. I lunged forward, pushing my hands against the glass, feeling the crack deepen with each touch. The figure behind me made no sound now. It was as though it had been silenced by the growing chaos around us. The crack spread wider, and I pushed harder, my hands bleeding from the pressure, from the glass cutting into my skin. But the wall didn't give in. It resisted. And the reflection, the one that had been smiling, moved. The reflection didn't wait for me to break through. It stepped out of the glass. In that moment, I realized the truth. The reflection hadn't just been a reflection. It had been something else. Something that had been waiting for me to break. Waiting for the moment when the wall would shatter and it could finally escape. It grinned, its mouth wide, too wide, a grotesque parody of a human smile. And then it lunged at me, its hands reaching for my throat. But the glass wasn't just a wall, it was a trap. And it had already caught me. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.